Welcome, dear listener. Gather close for tonight's tale from Middle-earth, the long and patient tale of the rings themselves, what they were, who made them, and how all of them, in the end, were bent to the will of a single dark and watchful hand. If these long, quiet tales have been a comfort to you, you might quietly subscribe and tap the small bell beside it, so that another evening like this one may find you when the next slow tale is ready, and so that no chapter of this long lore is lost to you. Tonight, dear listener, we turn to the very heart of Tolkien's great myth, to the rings of power, and to the one ring that ruled them all. We shall trace, age by age, the long history of those bright and terrible circles of gold and silver and mithril from the high forges of Eregion in the middle years of the Second Age, down through the long defeats and longer waitings of the Third Age, to the small bent finger of a hobbit at the very lip of the cracks of doom. To understand that ending, we must first stand for a while at the beginning and learn what such things truly were. For the rings of power, dear listener, were not jewelry. They were not, in any ordinary meaning of the word, weapons. They were not even, in the simplest reading of the lore, magical objects in the manner that later fantasy would imagine such things. They were, in the deeper sense, the lore presses upon us with great care, vessels into which the wills of their makers had been poured, vessels that held within their small bright circles a portion of the spirit and the longing and the craft of those who had wrought them, to where one was to be brought into communion with the Maker, however distant in time or place that Maker now might be. And so, when at last the one ring of all rings was forged in secret upon the slopes of Orodruin, it was not merely a ring that came into the world. It was a man, or rather a Maya, or rather a spirit that had once been called Myron the Admirable, poured almost wholly into a small thing of gold that could be slipped upon a finger, and so carried wheresoever its bearer might walk. That, dear listener, is the strangeness at the heart of this long lore, that a single small circle, no wider than a coin, no heavier than a beech-nut, was in truth the most concentrated act of will that Middle-earth had ever known. And it is the strangeness against which all the other rings, the 3 and the 7 and the 9, must be measured tonight. For each of them, in its way, was a smaller mirror of that same act. Each of them was a giving over of self into an object. Each of them was a wager that the Maker had reckoned the bargain rightly. Some of those wagers held, some of them did not. And the difference between those that held and those that did not is, in the end, the difference between freedom and dominion, between gift and chain, between the slow, gentle craft of the Eldar and the long, patient cunning of the dark Maya who came among them in disguise. Now the rings, dear listener, were not made all at once. They were made in a long and careful labor, in a city of the elves called Ost-in-Edhil, in a land of the elves called Eregion, which lay green and quiet against the western feet of the misty mountains in the middle years of the Second Age. That city is gone now, and its towers fallen, and the very lanes where its smiths once walked are buried beneath 30 long centuries of grass and leaf mold. But for a small bright window of years, perhaps 150 years out of the long span of Arda, it was the most learned and the most cunning place of craft that had ever stood in Middle-earth. The greatest of its smiths was Celebrimbor, the grandson of Feanor, the last of the high craftsmen of the line that had wrought the Silmarillions in the elder days, and it was Celebrimbor who would set his hand to the making of all the rings, save only the one, and Celebrimbor who would, in the end, be tortured to death upon the very threshold of his own ruined city for what he had wrought. We shall come to him in time, dear listener. We shall come to the long fair years of the friendship between his smiths and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm just across the mountain, when the gates of Moria stood open by day, and the road through the pass was a road of commerce and not of dread. We shall come to the slow arrival in Eregion of a fair-seeming stranger who called himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and who came offering knowledge that the elves had never quite been able to find on their own. We shall come to the long apprenticeship that followed, in which the elven smiths and the disguised Maya worked side by side at the forges of Ostin Ed Hill, learning of one another, drawing out of one another what each had to give. And we shall come, in time, to the moment in which the gifts went one way only, and the elves realized too late what they had taken into their workshops, and the great rift of the Second Age was opened. But before all of that, dear listener, before even the first hammerstroke upon the first ring, we must remember a still earlier story, the story of who Sauron had been before he was Sauron at all. For he was not always the Dark Lord. He was not always the great red eye upon the high tower. He was not always the maker of the One Ring. He had once been Mairon of the people of Ole the Smith, the brightest and the most gifted of all his master's apprentices in the deep days of the shaping of Arda. He had stood in the workshops of the Vala themselves and learned at the hands of one who was perhaps the greatest craftsman in the whole company of the powers, and he had been counted, in those early days, among the fairest and the most admirable of all the Maya. It is one of the quiet sorrows of Tolkien's lore that Sauron's gift was, in the beginning, a true gift, the love of pattern, the love of completion, the love of the well-made thing in which every part stood in its appointed place. It is that gift, twisted and grown vast, and grown unwilling to be opposed, that we shall watch tonight turn slowly through the long ages into something else. We shall watch it pass from Ol's bright forges into Morgoth's dark service. We shall watch it survive Morgoth's fall and the breaking of Beleriand. We shall watch it gather itself again in the early Second Age into a slow, careful plan, the plan of a craftsman who has decided that the world is not yet as well ordered as it ought to be, and that he with the proper tools might mend it. And we shall watch, dear listener, the proper tools take shape, first as the bright rings of the elves, then as the lesser rings of the dwarves and of mortal men, and at the last as the one ring, the master ring, the binding ring, into which he would pour what was left of himself in the hope that the whole pattern might at last close. Then we shall walk forward, dear listener, into the long ages that followed the forging. We shall watch the last alliance of elves and men march out of Lindon and Lothlorien and Imladris, the great host whose mustering had never been seen before and would never be seen again. We shall stand for a while upon the long dark plain of Dagorlad, where the captains of the West died in their hundreds beneath the gates of Mordor. We shall climb with Elendil and Gil-galad and Isildur and Anarion up the slopes of Orodruin and watch the dark hand of Sauron strike both of the High Kings to their deaths, and watch the broken hilt shard of Narsil cut the ring from Sauron's hand, and watch Sauron's spirit flee like a great black smoke from the body that the ring had upheld. And we shall watch, with a grief that the lore never tries to soften, Isildur turn aside from the council of Elrond and refuse to cast the ring into the fire that had given it being, and so begin the long second half of the ring's story, the slow, patient 3,000 years in which the ring waited, half asleep, for the chance to find a new way home. We shall follow it, dear listener, into the cold waters of the Gladden fields, where Isildur fell pierced with arrows, and the ring slid from his finger into the river that men afterwards called Anduin the Great. We shall watch it lie there for 2,500 years in the silt and the slow current, untouched by the sun, while the long history of Middle-earth ran on above it without knowing that the most dangerous small thing in the world lay sleeping just beneath its feet. We shall watch the slow chance, or perhaps the slow design, by which the ring at last was lifted out of the river by a small fishing creature named Diagol, and watch the dark, sudden murder by his cousin Smeagol, who took the ring for himself upon the very day of his birth, and was warped by it through 500 long years into the wretched whispering thing the world came to call Gollum. We shall watch the ring slip from Gollum at last, in the deep dark passages beneath the misty mountains, and be found by a hobbit of all unlikely creatures, a small, soft-footed hobbit of the Shire named Bilbo Baggins, who took it almost absent-mindedly into his pocket and carried it home to Hobbiton and kept it for 60 years on a quiet shelf in a quiet hole in a quiet hill. We shall watch the slow, gentle alarm of the wizard Gandalf as the truth of that small ring at last revealed itself to him. We shall watch Bilbo's farewell and Frodo's inheritance and the long councils at Rivendell, where the wise of the West gathered at last to decide what was to be done with the thing that had at last come back into the light. We shall watch the Fellowship set out and break and reform along 2 roads. We shall walk with Frodo and Sam through the dead marshes and over the high pass of Cirith Ungol and across the dead plain of Gorgoroth to the very cracks of doom. And we shall stand with them at the last upon the lip of the fire and watch the ring be unmade, though not by the hand that had carried it there. That, dear listener, is the long road tonight's tale must walk. It is a road of many miles and many centuries, and we shall walk it slowly, and we shall not hurry past the small, bright moments that lie along its course. We shall pause for a while at the friendship of Celebrimbor and Narvi, the elf and the dwarf who made the west gate of Moria together, as a sign of an age when such friendships were possible. We shall pause at the gentle sorrow of the 3 elven kings, Gil-galad and Galadriel and Círdan, who at the last hour saw what had been done in Eregion and hid their 3 rings away from Sauron's reach. We shall pause at the long, lonely watching of the Dunedain in the wild, the rangers in their grey cloaks who guarded the roads of Eriador for 1,000 years without thanks and without name, that the small, soft hobbits of the Shire might keep their gardens unbroken. We shall pause at the gentle weeping of Galadriel beside her mirror in Lothlorien when she chose at the last to let her ring go and to diminish and to go into the west. We shall pause at every place where the law pauses, and we shall let the long, slow shape of it gather in us as we go. But before all of that, dear listener, before even the first stroke of the hammer upon the first ring, we must do as Tolkien himself did when he set out to tell this tale, and we must go back further still, back to the deep days before the rising of the sun and the moon, when the only light upon Arda was the light of the 2 trees of Valinor, and the great powers of the world walked openly among the works of their own making. We must remember who the Valar were, and who the Maiar were, and what manner of being Sauron had been before he was Sauron. For without that remembering, the forging of the rings makes no sense, and the unmaking of the one ring makes still less, and the whole great pattern of Tolkien's myth, of which the rings are only the most visible part, slips out of focus and becomes only a tale of jewelry and treasure hunts. Tonight we shall not let it slip. We shall hold the whole shape of it in mind as we walk, and we shall let the small bright rings be what they truly were, the visible signs of an old and patient struggle between the love of the well-made thing held lightly and the love of the well-made thing clutched into dominion. Let us, dear listener, pause for a moment longer before we set out and consider the number of the rings themselves. For Tolkien gave us, in a small verse that has been carried by readers across 3 generations and learned by heart by many of them, the precise reckoning. 3 rings, the verse tells us, were given to the elven kings, the firstborn of all the children of Ilúvatar, those who would never of their own nature die. 7 rings were given to the Dwarf-lords in their halls of stone, the deep delvers of the mountains, the secret folk of all's making. 9 rings were given to the race of mortal men, those who were doomed to die under the long shadow of time. And 1 ring was made apart from all of them, in a darkness no other smith had ever shared, for the Dark Lord upon his dark throne in the land where the shadows lay. 1 ring to rule them all, the verse tells us. 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all together, and in the darkness to bind them. That is the simple shape of it, dear listener. 3 and 7 and 9 and 1, 20 rings in all, 20 small bright circles of power gone out into Middle-earth in the middle years of the Second Age. And yet, as so often in Tolkien's lore, the simple shape conceals a deeper one. For the 3 were not as the 7, and the 7 were not as the 9, and the 1 was unlike any of them. The 3 were of the elves, and held a craft that was wholly elven, untouched by Sauron's hand, given over to the keeping and the preservation of fair things, rather than the gaining or the dominion of them. The 7 were of a different making, wrought by Celebrimbor and the smiths of Eregion, but under the guidance of the disguised Maya who had come among them, and so a portion of his cunning was in them from the first. The 9 were as the 7 in their making, but bestowed upon a different race, a race whose nature was already drawn toward shadow by the gift of mortality itself, and so the 9 took hold of their wearers in a way the 7 could not quite manage upon the dwarves. And the 1, dear listener, the 1 was a thing entirely alone, made in secret, made without help, made with intent, made in fire that no elven smith had ever stood beside. The 3 would prove the most enduring, for their bearers would learn at the last hour to wield them only for preservation, and never to wield them at all so long as Sauron held the 1. The 7 would prove the most ill-suited to their purpose, for the dwarves were a folk who could not be easily turned from themselves. The rings did not make them wraiths, but only stirred in them a fierce and dragon-drawing hunger for gold, until of the 7 hordes 4 were consumed by dragons in the long years, and 3 were swallowed back by Sauron's own hand. The 9 would prove the most tragic, for the men who took them, proud kings and sorcerers and great captains of the mortal races, were brought slowly across long centuries into a state the law calls being a wraith, neither dead nor living, fading from the seen world into the unseen, until at last there were only the 9 voices of the Nazgul riding upon their black horses through the dark of the 3rd age. And the 1 would prove the most terrible of all, for in pouring himself so completely into a thing that could be lost, Sauron had bound his own fate to its keeping and made the unmaking of himself possible in a way it would never otherwise have been. There is, dear listener, a great philosophical weight in this small shape, a weight that Tolkien himself, in his quiet way, returns to again and again in the letters he wrote about his own great work. The rings of power are not, in his telling, about magic in the cheap sense. They are about the desire to preserve, to fix, to hold still the things one loves against the slow weathering of time. They are about the longing of the elves, the firstborn, to keep Middle-earth as fair as it had been in the youth of the world, and to refuse the slow change that the seasons and the centuries lay upon all things. They are about the longing of the dwarves to multiply their treasures beyond all measure, and the longing of mortal men to be released from their mortality. They are about the longing of Sauron himself, deeper than all of these, to order every leaf and every river and every hearth into the single pattern of his choosing, so that no untidy thing should ever again disturb the great machine of the world. And the lesson of the rings, dear listener, told slowly and with no bitterness by the law, is that all such longings, however lovingly held in the heart of the longer, become at last instruments of dominion. To hold tightly is to begin to grasp is to begin to bind is to begin to ruin. The elves who would have used their 3 rings to hold Middle-earth still against the long current of time would have done a quieter thing than Sauron, and a kinder thing, but they would in the end have done a related thing. They would have refused the world its slow, gentle change. They would have held a part of it apart from the slow seasons of growth and decay that Ilúvatar had set running through it. That is why, in the deep wisdom of the law, the 3 rings could not be kept once the 1 was unmade. To unmake the 1 was to unmake all the rings together, for they were of a single craft and a single underlying art, and so the long, fair preservation of Lothlorien and of Rivendell and of the Grey Havens was given up in the same fire that ended Sauron's dominion. The elves, who could have held back, chose instead to let go, and so the world was given back to itself, to its own slow weathering, to its own seasons of decay and renewal, to the long, quiet rise of the dominion of men. That, dear listener, is the deeper shape of the tale we shall tell tonight. It is not only the tale of a dark lord and a small hobbit, it is the tale of every longing that has ever wished to fix the world in place, and of the long, slow lesson learned across 3 ages and 20 rings and many tens of thousands of lives, that fixing the world in place is the one thing not even the wisest of its makers were meant to do. It is the tale of the difference between holding and grasping, between gift and chain, between the love that lets go and the love that binds. And it is the tale, in the end, of the small mercy that ran like a quiet thread through all the long years of the ring's journey, and at the very last hour did the thing that no greater hand could do. And so, dear listener, draw a little closer. Let the small lamp beside you burn a little lower if it pleases you, or higher if you would rather see the painted cards as they pass. Settle into whatever quiet posture serves you best for a long and unhurried listening. We have many miles to walk tonight, and many ages to cross, and a great many small, bright moments to gather up along the way. The road begins, as all the great roads of Middle-earth begin, in a time before any small hand had yet been raised to strike the first stroke of a hammer. In the deep days of the shaping of Arda, in the silver light of the tree. To understand what the rings were, dear listener, we must first understand who made them, and to understand who made them, we must first understand the world in which their makers had grown to be themselves. And so we begin not in Eregion, not in any forge, not even in any age that bore a number that mortal men or elves had yet learned to count, but in the deep, timeless days before the rising of the sun and the moon, in the long age that the lore calls the years of the trees. In those days, dear listener, the light upon Arda did not come from any star that we would recognize. It did not come from any sun, for the sun had not yet been kindled. It did not come from any moon, for the moon had not yet been set rolling upon its long path through the heavens. It came rather from two great trees that stood within a walled garden upon a high green mound in the heart of the western land of Valinor. The names of the trees were Telperion and Loreley. The first gave forth a silver light that swelled slowly to its full brightness, and then slowly faded again. The second gave forth a golden light that swelled and faded in answer, so that the two lights overlapped at dawn and at dusk, and were never wholly absent, and never wholly present at the same hour. The wise of the elves, who long afterwards remembered those days, spoke of them with a quiet ache in their voices, for nothing that came afterwards, not the brightness of the new kindled sun, nor the soft silver of the new moon, was ever quite as fair as the light of those first trees had been. In that silver and golden light, dear listener, the great powers of the world walked openly and unhindered upon the green earth of Valinor. These were the Valar, the holy ones, the great spirits who had come down into Arda at the bidding of Ilúvatar, the one, the father of all, to take up the long labor of its shaping. 14 of them there were in the High Council, 7 kings and 7 queens, and each of them had their own portion of the great work, and each of them bore their own gift and their own care. Manwë was the king of the air, and of the high places, and of all that flew upon wings. His consort Varda, whom the elves loved best, and called Elbereth, was the kindler of the stars. Ulmo was the lord of all waters, of the rivers and the seas, and the slow currents that ran beneath all the lands. The Yavanna was the giver of fruits, the queen of all growing things, and among them, dear listener, was Aule, the smith, the maker, the friend of the mountain and of the ore, and of the deep places of the earth. And it is at his shoulder that we must stand for a moment, for it is from his household that the Dark Lord, whom we have come to know as Sauron, first came into the world. Aule, dear listener, was the great craftsman of the Valar. He had been with Manwë and with Ulmo at the very first shaping of Arda, when the seas had been cut from the land and the mountains had been raised up out of the deep flats of the new world. He had been the one who delighted, above all the powers, in the making of things, in the slow drawing out of metal from rough stone, in the careful working of one substance into another, in the long discipline by which the rough is made fair and the formless is given a shape. He was not in his own nature a wicked being in the least. He was generous and great-hearted and full of joy at the making of every new thing under his hand. He had made, in love and patience, and without leave of his own to do so, the 7 fathers of the dwarves, a folk whom Ilúvatar himself afterwards adopted and gave true life to, and from whom the long dwarven line had come. He was the master and the teacher of many of the lesser spirits, the Maiar, those who had come down into Arda in the wake of the Vala, and who served them as apprentices and helpers and companions in the long work of the world's making. And the brightest of all Aule's apprentices, dear listener, the most gifted, the most admirable, the one in whom his master's love of pattern and of the well-made thing seemed to burn the most clearly, was a Maiar named Myron. That is the name that the law gives him in his early days. Myron, the admirable, the praiseworthy, the one to be looked up to. It is a name we are not used to hearing, for he is known to us by the later name that the elves gave him in scorn, the name Sauron, which means in their tongue the abhorred. But before he was Sauron, before he was the Dark Lord, before he was the maker of the One Ring, he was Meror, and he stood among the household of all the smith. And he was loved, and he was admired, and he gave back love and admiration in his turn. What turned him, dear listener, the law tells with great care and great patience, was not any single hour of fall. It was a long, slow drift across many ages, a drift whose first step was small enough to seem innocent. Myron loved order. He loved the well-made pattern. He loved the world in which every part stood in its right place and performed its right office. And in the deep days of the first shaping, when the great discord of Melkor, the brother of Manwë, the mightiest of the Vala, the one who had broken the music of the Ainur with his own proud rebellious theme, was still working its long ruin upon the new earth, Myron began to feel a slow and patient impatience with the slowness of the powers of the West. They were too gentle, he came to think. They were too unwilling to compel. They left too much to the choice of the small, free creatures who would in time inhabit the world. And Melkor, the great rebel, the dark Vala, who had set himself against his brothers. Melkor, in his terrible energy, in his refusal to be opposed, in his eagerness to set the world in order by sheer force of will, Melkor came at last to seem to Mairon the more efficient master. It was not, dear listener, that Mairon ceased to love order. It was that he came to love a particular kind of order more than he loved any other thing. An order imposed, an order that brooked no rebellion, an order in which no untidy small voice should ever again disturb the great hum of the running of the whole. And so, by a path the law does not date precisely, but which the law-masters place somewhere in the long uncounted years of the shaping, Mairon left the household of all, and went secretly over to the service of Melkor, and became his chief lieutenant, the captain of his fortress of Angband, in the deep north of Middle-earth, the most cunning and the most patient of all the Dark Lord's servants. And when at last, after the long wars of the First Age, after the breaking of Beleriand, after the host of the West had come at the very end and overthrown Melkor, and cast him out beyond the walls of the world, Mairon, who by then was called Sauron, was the only one of the great captains of darkness to escape that ruin and remain in Middle-earth. For a time, dear listener, he repented, or rather he seemed to repent. The host of the West summoned him, after the fall of Angband, to come to Valinor and to stand judgment for what he had done. He was afraid to come. He could not bear the thought of facing Aule, his old master, and being held to account before him. He could not bear the thought of the long, humble penance that would have been required of him, the slow stripping of his pride. And so he hid himself instead in the wild lands of Middle-earth, in the dark places that the host had not searched, and he waited there in silence for many long years while the wounds of the First Age slowly healed and the seas slowly settled into their new shapes, and the new sun and new moon rose and set above the new world. And in that long silence, dear listener, Sauron's old love of pattern came back upon him with renewed force. He saw Middle-earth, free now of Melkor's open tyranny, beginning to scatter into many small kingdoms and many small peoples and many small bickering courts. He saw the elves of Lindon under Gil-galad gathering quietly in the west. He saw the new men of Númenor, who had been raised up by the Valar after the wars, sailing eastward in their tall ships and beginning to set foot upon the shores of the old lands. He saw the dwarves of Khazad-dûm delving ever deeper beneath the misty mountains. He saw the slow forming of small principalities and trading posts and frontier towns all across the wide rolling country of Eriador and Rovanion, and it seemed to him, dear listener, that the world had grown again into a great untidy thing, and that what it needed, what it desperately needed, was a single hand to gather it back into order. He did not, in those early years of the Second Age, present himself openly as a Dark Lord. He had learned from Melkor's mistake. Melkor had ruled by terror, and terror had at last roused the West against him and broken him. Sauron would rule, he had decided, by love, by being loved, by being trusted, by being welcomed in as a friend and a teacher and a giver of gifts. He would clothe himself in fair form. He would speak with a fair voice. He would offer his great craft to those who would receive it, and he would teach them, and he would so quietly bind them to him by the long indebtedness of the gift that they would not perceive their binding until it was already long past undoing. That, dear listener, was the plan that Sauron set himself in the early Second Age, and it is the plan that gives us, by its slow unfolding, the long history of the Rings of Power. Now we must turn for a while, dear listener, from Sauron and his slow, patient designs, and consider the elves of Middle-earth in those same early years of the Second Age, and especially the elves who, against the counsel of the wise, had chosen not to depart over the sea to Valinor after the wars, but to remain in the lands of their birth. For there were many such, and they were of many kindreds, and they had begun in those years to gather themselves into new realms in the wide green country east of the Blue Mountains. Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, the last of the line of Fingon, had set up his court in the green coastlands of Lindon, hard by the western sea. Círdan the shipwright, the lord of the Falathrim, had built his small grey town at Mithlond, the grey havens, where the long ships were still made for those of the elves who would yet take the road into the west. Thranduil's father, Oropher, had led his quiet Sindarin folk into the great forest east of the Anduin that men afterwards called Mirkwood, and Galadriel and her husband Celeborn had wandered for a long while in many lands before settling in the middle years of the Second Age in a high land called Eregion, under the western flanks of the Misty Mountains, hard by the western gate of the dwarven realm of Khazad-dûm. Eregion, dear listener, Hollin in the speech of mortal men, was a fair country. It was a high, stony land with deep green valleys folded into it and small, swift rivers running down out of the mountains toward the great river Glanduin and so onward to the grey flood and the sea. The hills were thick with holly trees, and it is from the holly that the land had taken its elven name. The light there was clear and cool, and the air bore down off the snows of Caradhras and the other tall mountains. The smiths who came to settle in that land said, in the long fair years of the early Second Age, that no air in all of Middle-earth was so good for the making of fine work as the air of Eregion. And so they came, in the years after Galadriel and Celeborn's coming, a great gathering of the most gifted of the Noldor, the deep craft people, the ones who in the elder days had learned at the feet of All himself in Valinor before the Great Rebellion, and they founded in Eregion a city which they called Ost-in-Edhil, the fortress of the Eldar, and they founded among themselves a brotherhood of smiths, which they called the Gwaith-y-Myrdain, the people of the jewel-smiths, and at the head of that brotherhood they set the greatest of their number, a craftsman whose hand had not been matched in Middle-earth since the elder days. His name, dear listener, was Celebrimbor. Celebrimbor was of the high line. He was the grandson of Feanor, the maker of the Silmarils, the most gifted of all the elven smiths who had ever lived, and also the most fated, the elf whose great oath had drawn the Noldor into the long wars of Beleriand and to the breaking of their own kindreds at the kinslaying of Alqualond. Celebrimbor's father had been Curufin, the most like-minded of Feanor's 7 sons, the one who had inherited not only his father's craft, but also a portion of his father's hard pride. And Celebrimbor had grown up in the long shadow of that line, beside that hard pride, watching what it could do, watching the kinslaying, watching the long wars, watching at last the slow ruin of his own house. And he had, in the end, broken with it. He had repudiated his father's deeds. He had refused to follow Curufin in the later betrayals of Nargothrond. He had stood apart from the worst of his line's sins, and he had come into the Second Age as a craftsman who carried in his hands the inheritance of his grandfather's skill, but in his heart a quieter and gentler spirit. He was, the lore tells us with care, a good man, or rather a good elf, and he was beloved among the smiths who gathered to him in Eregion. For a time, dear listener, those were good years. The Gwaith Myrdain prospered in Ostin Edhill. Their craft was the finest that had been wrought in Middle-earth since the days of Gondolin. They made tools and weapons and ornaments and small marvels of every kind, and they sent their wares out across the wide country to be marveled at in the courts of the Sindar and the men of Numenor and the dwarves under the mountains. And especially they made a great and unbroken friendship with the dwarves across the pass at Khazad-dûm, whose deep halls under the misty mountains stood at the very height of their long flowering in those years, with King Durin III upon the throne, and the mithril mines of Moria pouring forth their slow silver into the bright sunlight of the world. The friendship of Eregion and Khazad-dûm was the closest such friendship that elves and dwarves had ever known. The west gate of Moria in those years stood often open by day, and the road through the pass was a road of merchants and travellers, and not of dread. Celebrimbor himself, the lore tells us, became fast friends with the dwarven craftsman Narvi, and the two of them together wrought the great west doors of Moria with their script of Ihildin that the moonlight could read, and that we shall come to in due time. The mithril of Moria, the most precious metal in all of Middle-earth, came up out of the deep mines and into the hands of the elven smiths of Ostin Edhill, and the things they wrought of it were marvels indeed. Let us linger, dear listener, upon the friendship of Celebrimbor and Narvi for a moment longer, for it is one of the small, bright moments that the lore preserves with particular care, and it stands in such gentle contrast to the long darknesses that came afterwards that the memory of it warms the rest of the tale. Narvi was a dwarven craftsman of Khazad-dûm in those years, a master of doors and of gates and of the slow, patient art of working stone so that it would obey the small mechanisms of its makers. He had set his hand to many of the great works of Khazad-dûm in the time of King Durin III, the great staircase that wound up from the deep mines into the high halls, the bridges that spanned the dark chasms of the lower levels, the carved chambers where the dwarven smiths set their forges. And he and Celebrimbor, somehow in the long traffic between Eregion and the Mountain Kingdom, had become friends. They met often, the lore tells us, at the western gate of Moria. They sat together upon the long stone steps that came up out of the valley to the cliff face. They spoke of craft. They spoke of stone and of metal and of the slow art of mingling the two. They spoke, perhaps, of the long histories of their two peoples and of the strangeness that those peoples had at last come to such friendship. For in earlier ages the elves and the dwarves had been wary of one another, and the long memory of certain hurts in the elder days had not been wholly forgotten. But in those bright years of Eregion and of Khazad-dûm at its height, the hurts had been laid aside, and the friendship was true, and the work the two friends did together was true work. They wrought together, in the long years of their friendship, the great west doors of Moria. These were the doors that opened from the western valley into the deep halls of the dwarven kingdom, the doors that travellers used when the long high road over Caradhras was closed by snow and the lower road through Moria was preferred. The doors themselves were of mithril and of Ihildin, that strange white metal of elven making whose name means star-moon, and which is invisible by day and by ordinary firelight but shines forth with a cool silver brightness when the moon or the stars look upon it. Narvi shaped the stone of the doors and the mechanism by which they opened. Celebrimbor wrought the Ihildin tracery that ran across their face, the slow looping script that bore his friend Narvi's name and his own, and the words of the password by which the doors would open to those who knew them. They wrote in the script of Ihildin upon those doors words that for many long ages afterwards no traveller could read until the moonlight or the starlight fell upon them. "The doors of Durin, Lord of Moria," the words said. "Speak, friend, and enter." "I, Navi, made them," the script went on. "Celebrimbor of Hollin drew these signs. Such was the work of two friends in the bright years of Eregion. It would stand, dear listener, long after both of them were dust, long after Eregion itself was a ruin under grass, long after Khazad-dûm itself had been emptied of its dwarves and given over to the deep dark thing that we know as the Balrog. The doors would still stand, sealed against the dust of 3,000 years, when at last a small company of travelers stood before them on a cold winter night in the late Third Age, and at last spoke the word that opened them. But that, dear listener, is for the later part of our tale. We mention the doors here only because they are the small bright mark of what Eregion was in those years. The friendship that wrought them was the friendship of an age. It was the friendship of two craftsmen who loved their craft, and who loved one another's craft, and who saw in each other something of what their own peoples had lost or had never had, and who took joy in the joining. Such friendships, the lore quietly tells us, are not common. They flower in particular years and in particular places, and when those years pass and those places end, the friendships that grew in them pass also, and what remains is only the work, the doors that still stand, the small signs that still glimmer when the light is right. The friendship itself is gone forever, and so we may understand, dear listener, why Celebrimbor was so unguarded when at last the stranger came. He was a craftsman in the long, sweet years of his craft. He was at the height of his powers. He had friends who loved him, and a city that flourished, and a brotherhood of smiths who looked to him as their captain. He had every reason to believe that the world was at its best, that the long shadow of Melkor had been thrown down forever, that nothing remained against which the long patient flowering of fair craft need defend itself. He was not, in any deep sense, naive. He was simply living in the brightness of his own good years, and he had not yet been schooled by long hurt to look for the dark shape behind every fair-seeming visitor at his gates. And it was in those years, dear listener, in the very brightness and prosperity of Eregion, that the stranger came. He came alone, or seemed to come alone, walking out of the east with no train of servants and no display of state. He was tall, and his form was fair, and his hair was bright, and his eyes had a quiet wisdom in them, and he carried himself as a great one, but a humble great one, a teacher rather than a king. He named himself Annatar, which, in the elven tongue, means the Lord of Gifts. He said that he had been sent, or rather that he had come of his own will, out of the east where he had long dwelt among the wise of those lands, to share with the elves of the west the knowledge that he had gathered there. He said he had been numbered in earlier ages among the household of all himself, and this, dear listener, was the only part of his self-presentation that contained any truth, though even there the truth was bent. He said he wished only to teach, only to give, only to add to the long flowering of elven craft what he had brought back with him from the deep lore of the East. Gil-galad, the High King in Lindon, did not believe him. From the moment word of the stranger reached him, Gil-galad mistrusted the smooth speech and the fair form. He sent word to Galadriel in Eregion that she should not receive this Lord of Gifts, that no such being should be lightly trusted, that the long memory of the elves should bend itself to suspicion in this hour. And Galadriel herself, the lore tells us, was of like mind. She had the gift of seeing into hearts, and she perceived something in the visitor that her instinct shrank back from, even though she could not quite name what it was. She refused to admit Annatar to the high councils of Eregion. She refused to sit at table with him. She advised Celebrimbor that the stranger should be sent back the way he had come. Let us pause, dear listener, upon Annatar's fair form a moment longer, for the lore presses upon us with some care that this form was not a small or careless thing. Sauron, in his earlier days as Myron, had been counted among the fairest of the Maiar, a being whose beauty, when he chose to wear a fair form, was great enough to deceive even the wise. He had not lost that capacity by his long fall. He had only lost the right to it. And so when he came to Eregion in his guise as Annatar, the form he wore was indeed a thing of great fairness, tall and stately, with hair like spun gold, with a face of grave wisdom, with hands long and fine, and seeming made for the working of marvels. His voice was a low, rich music. His manner was patient. His eyes, when they rested upon any new craftsman of the Mirdan, gave that craftsman the immediate sense of being seen, of being understood, of being taken seriously as a maker. There was no shadow upon him that any but the most penetrating eye could discern. Galadriel saw it, perhaps, because Galadriel had been schooled in the deep wisdom of Valinor by Melian herself in the elder days, and her sight was as keen as any sight then in Middle-earth. Gil-galad sensed it from afar, perhaps because he was High King, and the heavy responsibility of his office had trained his caution to a fine edge. But the Myrdain, who were craftsmen and not seers, did not see what Galadriel saw. They saw only a great teacher come at last out of the east, ready to give of his deep lore. And his gifts were real, dear listener. That is the harder truth about Sauron's deception in those years, that he was not a charlatan, that the craft he taught was not false, that the lore he shared with the Myrdain was a true lore. He did know the things he said he knew. He had been in Owl's household. He had learned at All's hand, and in the long ages since he had refined that learning into a working that no other being in Middle-earth could match. He taught the Myrdan how to fold a small portion of the Maker's own will into the metal at the moment of its forging. He taught them how to lend the metal a small, slow life of its own, so that a thing once made would remember its making and would, in some small way, carry the maker forward through time. He taught them the long art of pattern within pattern, of weaving a small underlying form into a greater overlying form, so that the two together held a power neither alone could hold. These were all true arts. They were arts the Myrdain had not before known. The wonder the smiths felt as they learned them was not a manufactured wonder. It was the real wonder of craftsmen who have just been shown a door in their own workshop they had not known was there, and who, opening it, find a long, bright room of further craft beyond. What Sauron did not teach them, dear listener, was the use to which those arts could be put. He did not teach them, for he did not wish them to learn, that an art which can fold a portion of one will into a thing can also fold a portion of that thing into another will. He did not teach them that the small thread which made the made thing remember its maker could, by a sufficiently strong maker, be drawn from far away to compel the made thing's bearer. He did not teach them that a master pattern, once set in place, can govern all the lesser patterns that share its form. These were the secrets he kept back. These were the parts of the craft he reserved to himself, to be employed only later, only in his own secret forge, only when the long apprenticeship of the Myrdain had given him the material he needed to set his master pattern into place. The Myrdain did not even know that there were such parts to the craft. They learned the parts they were given, and they marveled at them, and they did not perceive that the long, beautiful arts they were being shown were only the visible half of a craft whose darker half was being withheld. But Celebrimbor, dear listener, Celebrimbor and the Gwathi Myrdain, the smiths who had set their hearts upon the making of greater and ever greater works, Celebrimbor heard in the words of Annatar the promise of a craft beyond any he had yet conceived. Annatar spoke of the making of small things that would hold the wills of their makers within them, of the working of metal so that it became almost a creature in itself, of the long art by which the slow weathering of all fair things might be slowed, almost to a stop. He spoke of preserving Middle-earth as it had been in the days of its youth before the long fading had begun. He spoke of giving the elves a way to refuse, at last, the slow decay that their long memory and their long love of fair things had taught them most to dread. And Celebrimbor, who loved his craft above almost all else, and who loved Middle-earth and could not bear to think of it fading, was caught. He admitted Annatar into Osten Edhill over Galadriel's objection. He took him into the workshops of the Myrdain. He shared with him the long lore of the elven smiths, the secret arts that Feanor and his sons had brought out of Valinor, and that the line of the Noldor had jealously guarded ever since. And Annatar in return gave openly of his own art, and the two arts mingled, and the Myrdain learned many new things, and a great brightening seemed to come upon their work in those years. And for nearly 100 years, perhaps somewhat more, the smiths of Eregion and the disguised Maya labored side by side in the cool stone of Ost-in-Edhil, drawing out of one another the deepest secrets of the working of will into matter. Galadriel watched in growing unease. She at last withdrew herself from Eregion altogether, taking her husband Celebrimbor with her, and crossing the misty mountains by the high pass to dwell for a season in the green lands that would in long ages become Lothlorien. But Celebrimbor, in his bright eagerness for the craft, didn't follow her. He remained at his forge. It was in those years, dear listener, that the first of the rings began to be made. The lore is precise about the order in which they came. First, the Myrdain and Annatar together wrought, as a kind of apprentice work, a number of lesser rings, small experimental things by which the new art was tried out and refined. The lore does not tell us how many of these first lesser rings were made, only that they were many, and that none of them were the great rings that we shall come to. They were practice. They were the long, patient, slow learning of the new art, and from them, in time, the Myrdain learned enough that they grew bold to attempt greater works. It was then, after the long apprenticeship of the lesser rings, that the Myrdain set themselves to make rings of true power. 16 such rings they made in all in this first great work, and all 16 were made together by the smiths of Eregion, working in close communion with Annatar, drawing upon the joint craft that the long years of shared labor had given them. 7 of those 16 were destined, though the smiths did not yet know it, for the dwarven lords of the 7 houses. 9 of them were destined for the great mortal kings of men. Of the 16, the lore tells us no one ring was greater than any other in raw craft. They were all made of the same art by the same hands, in the same forges, in the same years, and every one of them had within it a portion of the cunning that Annatar had brought from the east, woven into the metal at the moment of its making by the very art that he had taught them. This, dear listener, is the quiet hinge upon which the long story turns. Celebrimbor and the Myrdain believed, in the long good faith of their labor, that they were making rings of preservation, rings that would help the firstborn and the dwarven kings and the great mortal men to hold the fair things of Middle-earth a little longer against the slow current of time. They believed they were making gifts. They did not know that the very art by which they wrought, the art Annatar had patiently taught them, was an art whose every working bore the small invisible mark of its hidden teacher. They did not know that into every one of those 16 rings, woven so finely that even an elven eye could not detect it, was set a small thread that would one day be drawn from afar. But the 3 rings, dear listener, the 3 that we know as Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, were of a different making. After the 16 had been completed, after Annatar had stood back as if his work were done, after the Myrdain had grown a little weary of the long shared labor, and had wished to make something at last that was wholly their own, Celebrimbor, working alone, working in secret even from the smith who had been his master through the years of the 16, set himself to make 3 more. He used the deepest of the lore he had learned, including much that he had drawn from Annatar, but he made these 3 without Annatar's hand upon them, without Annatar's voice in the working, without Annatar's pattern woven into the metal at the founding stroke. They were his own. They were the high crown of the elven craft, as the Myrdain had brought it to perfection, and he made them, as far as he could make them, free. The 3 rings, dear listener, were not of the same metal as the 16, nor were they of the same form. Each of them was a singular thing, a thing of its own particular beauty. Narya was set with a great red stone, and its virtue was the kindling of fires in the hearts of those who were faint, the rousing of courage, the slow, steady warmth that does not let the long cold of weariness take its bearer. Nenya was set with a stone of adamant, white and clear, and its virtue was a quiet, hidden power of preservation, of holding a fair place fair against the slow fading of the world around it, and the metal of its band was mithril drawn from the deep mines of Khazad-dûm across the pass. Vilya, the greatest of the three, was set with a great blue sapphire and bound in gold, and its virtue was a high lordly power of healing and of the keeping of order, the most kingly of the elven rings, the one in which the high craft of Celebrimbor's grandfather's line shone perhaps the most clearly. These three Celebrimbor made for the elves alone. He set himself, the lore tells us, with quiet care to keep their making hidden from Annatar, that they might be a thing wholly of the elves and not of the shared art. And when those three were finished, dear listener, the long work of the Mirdain in Eregion was at last done. The 16 lay ready in their cases. The 3 lay ready in their secret. Annatar, for reasons the smiths did not at first understand, took his leave of Ost-in-Edh-Hill. He spoke fair words. He thanked Celebrimbor for the long years of fellowship. He gathered his small store of belongings and walked out of the city with no train and no fanfare, just as he had come, and he was not seen in Eregion again for many years. What had happened, dear listener, was this. Annatar, who was of course Sauron in disguise, had perceived, even through Celebrimbor's care, that something had been made apart from his hand. He had perceived that the elven smith had not in the end trusted him utterly, that the 3 greatest rings had been wrought without his counsel, that the long deception had not in the end been quite complete. And so he withdrew, smiling, and walked the long road east, back into the lands he had been preparing for himself across all the slow years of his pretended teaching. He went to a high-blasted plateau in the southeast, a land ringed about by tall, jagged mountains and watched over by a single great fire mountain that the elves later called Orodruin. He went there because that land was his, because in the long years of his hiding after the fall of Angband, he had quietly chosen it and made it his own, and had begun to raise upon a high spur of its western mountains the foundation stones of a great tower he would call Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower. He went there, dear listener, to make a ring of his own. But before we follow him to Mount Doom and to the secret forge in which the one ring was wrought, let us pause for a while longer at Eregion and look more carefully upon the rings that the Mirdain had made together with him. For these were, in their way, marvelous things in their own right, even given the small hidden thread that ran through them, and the lore lingers upon them, and so shall we. The 7 rings, dear listener, the rings that were afterwards given to the Dwarf-lords, these were rings of plain heavy gold for the most part, set each with a single great jewel of its own particular kind. The lore does not tell us in detail the design of each of them, but it tells us enough that we may picture them in our minds. Thick, bright bands of gold, each crowned by a stone, each weighty in the hand, each cool to the touch, even when the day was warm. They were made, the smiths intended, to give to the Dwarf-lords a long, quiet endurance, a strengthening of their already considerable resistance to the slow wearing of the years, a deepening of their already considerable cunning at the working of metal and of stone. They were thought of, in those bright years of the Mirdain, as gifts of friendship, marks of the long fellowship between the Elves of Eregion and the Dwarves of Moria. They were not yet, in the smith's mind, instruments of dominion. But the 7, dear listener, did not in the long event work upon the dwarves quite as the smiths had imagined. For the dwarves are a tough folk, a folk hard to bend, a folk whose nature was set into them by all at their very first shaping, and not by Eru's later breathing. Their souls, the lore tells us, were of a different fibre than the souls of elves or of men. They could not be made into wraiths, they could not be drawn, however slowly, however patiently, from the seen world into the unseen. The art that Annatar had folded into the seven would have wrought upon another race a slow, long fading, a slow, long thinning of self into shadow. But upon the dwarves it could not take that hold. What it did instead was kindle in them a hunger. Each of the seven rings, as the long years passed, and the dwarven lord who bore it grew older, kindled in its bearer a slow, deep, patient love of gold, not the simple craftsman's love of working it well, which the dwarves had always possessed. Something darker, a love of having it, a love of heaping it, a love of sitting upon it in the deep dark of a great hall and counting it again and again, and the dragons of the cold north, who could smell such hoards from immense distances, were drawn slowly, slowly, slowly to the dwarven kingdoms where the rings had begun their work. Of the seven hordes, in the long centuries that followed, 4 were taken by dragons, and the dwarven kings who held them were consumed. The other 3 rings were drawn back, in slow, patient time, into the hands of Sauron himself, who used what was left of his old craft to call them home. By the time of our tale's end, the 7 were spent. No dwarf still bore one. The hordes were broken. The kingdoms had been driven into long, lonely wandering, until at last only Erebor under the lonely mountain and the iron hills and the slowly hoped-for return to Khazad-dûm remained of the old dwarven realms. The 9 rings, dear listener, were the saddest of all the works of the Myrdain. They were of a craft as fine as that of the 7, bright bands of gold or of silver, each set with its own great stone, each as carefully wrought as any of the rings of the dwarves. But they were given, in the slow course of the Second Age, into the hands of 9 great mortal men. Some of these men were kings of the new realms that the men of Numenor had founded along the coasts of Middle-earth. Some were great sorcerers of the eastern lands, drawn to Sauron in his fairer years by the promise of long life and long power. Some were chieftains of the wild folk of Rhûn, and of Harad, and of the lands south and east of the great river. The lore does not name all 9 of them. It tells us only that they were great men in their own days, lords of cities and captains of armies, men whose long shadow lay heavy upon the regions they ruled. Each of the 9, in the moment of receiving his ring, believed that he had been given a great and noble gift. The rings of men, the lore tells us, gave to their wearers an immediate brightening of all their natural powers. The strong became stronger, the cunning became more cunning, the fair-spoken became more fair-spoken, the kings became greater kings, and the sorcerers became greater sorcerers, and the captains became greater captains. And, most precious of all to mortal men, the wearers of the 9 did not die. The slow weathering of years did not lay them in their tombs, as it laid their wives and their sons and their grandsons. They walked on and on and on, decade after decade, century after century, while all the small mortal lives around them ran their courses and ended. They became, in the eyes of their peoples, almost as the elves had once been, almost beyond mortality, almost beyond the long sundering of death. But the price of that long unwithering, dear listener, was a slow and terrible thing, for the 9 were of the same hidden art as the 7, and that art which could not bind the dwarves could bind men with terrible ease. Slowly, in the long centuries of their unnatural life, the 9 kings began to fade, not in their bodies at first, but in their selves. The color leached slowly out of them. The strength of their own private wills slowly thinned. The voice of Sauron, far away in his hidden eastern strongholds, slowly, slowly, slowly grew clearer in their thought, until at last the small thread that Annatar had woven into each ring at its making was drawn taut, and the 9 were brought wholly into his service. They became wraiths. They passed at last out of the seen world into the unseen. They wore their rings upon invisible fingers, and their bodies could no longer be seen at all by any creature who did not also stand in the unseen. Only the long black robes they wrapped about themselves, and the boots they wore upon their fading feet, and the helms they set upon their fading brows, were left for the seen world to look upon. And so the Nazgul came to be, the Ringwraiths, the 9 riders, the most terrible of all the servants of the Dark Lord, who would haunt the long third age upon their black horses, and afterward upon their black-winged beasts, ever in search of the one ring of all rings that their master had lost. That, dear listener, was the long fate of the Nine. But all of this, the slow corruption of the dwarves, the slow wraithing of the men, was hidden in the future on the day the 16 rings were finished in Eregion. On that day, the smiths looked upon their work and saw that it was very fair, and they did not yet know what they had wrought. And then, dear listener, the three that Celebrimbor had made alone, in secret after Annatar's withdrawal. We have spoken of them briefly already. Let us now look upon them more closely, for they are the rings that mattered most to the long lore of Middle-earth. Narya, the ring of fire, was the ring of the warm heart. It was a band of gold set with a single great ruby, and the light of it, when it was unconcealed, was a slow, steady red like the heart of a banked hearth fire seen through dark stone. Its virtue was not the kindling of any literal flame. Rather, it kindled in the hearts of those near its bearer the small fires of courage, of perseverance, of hope refused to die. Where Narya was worn, the lore tells us, men did not despair. They might grow weary, but they did not lay down their swords. They might be cold, but they did not freeze in their hearts. It was a ring well suited to a long resistance against a long shadow. And so, when in the fullness of time it passed at last, from Celebrimbor's hand into Círdan's keeping at the Grey Havens, and from Círdan onward to the wizard Mithrandir, whom we know as Gandalf upon his first coming to Middle-earth. It found there, perhaps, the truest hand it would ever know. Gandalf wore it hidden upon his finger through the long ages of his quiet labor, and the slow warmth it gave was the warmth he in turn gave to all the small free peoples whose hearts would otherwise have failed. Nenya, the ring of water, was the ring of preservation. It was a band of mithril, drawn from the deep mines of Moria across the pass, set with a single white stone of adamant, whose light was cool and bright and unwavering, like the silver light of a far star reflected in still water. Its virtue was the slow holding of fair things against the slow weathering of time. Where Nenya was worn, the slow seasons of growth and decay were held at a quiet remove. The leaves did not fall, the grass did not yellow. The slow aging of stone was slowed almost to a stop. It was a ring well suited to the keeping of a single fair country, apart from the long, slow change of the wider world. And so, when in the fullness of time it passed at last from Celebrimbor's hand into Galadriel's keeping in the high lands east of the mountains, it found in her perhaps the only bearer in all of Middle-earth, strong enough to wield it without falling into pride. Galadriel wore Nenya for nearly the whole of the Third Age, and the golden wood of Lothlorien, which she and Celeborn afterwards made their realm, was held by Nenya's quiet virtue in a long, unchanging summer, while all the lands around it weathered and changed, and slowly forgot the elder days. Vilya, the ring of air, was the greatest of the three. It was a band of bright gold, set with a single great sapphire of deep blue, whose light was like a high clear sky after long rain. Its virtue was the high lordly virtue of healing and of order, the most kingly of the three powers, the one whose use was most befitting to a great lord. Where Vilya was worn, the wounds of the body and the wounds of the spirit healed swiftly. The slow turning of the seasons obeyed the will of its bearer in small gentle ways. The order of a great household kept itself almost without effort. It was a ring well suited to a high king of the elves, in the long defending of his last realm. And so, when in the fullness of time it passed at last from Celebrimbor's hand into Gil-galad's keeping in Lindon, it served the High King through the great wars of the Second Age, and afterwards passed, by Gil-galad's gift at the very end of his life, into the keeping of his herald Elrond, who would bear it through the long Third Age in the hidden valley of Imladris that we know as Rivendell. And by Vilya's quiet virtue, Rivendell was held as a place of healing for all the long centuries that followed, a refuge to which the weary and the wounded of every age might come and find that the slow weathering of their hurts was eased. Those, dear listener, were the three. They were not, in the smith's intention, made for any lord of men or of dwarves. They were made for the firstborn, for the elven kindreds that were to remain in Middle-earth through the long fading, that the fair things of the elder days might be held a little longer against the slow turning of the world. They were made in love. They were made without any thought of dominion. They were the highest work of Celebrimbor's life, and the only work perhaps in which the bright pride of his grandfather's line was wholly redeemed into something gentler and finer. And yet, dear listener, even the three were not wholly free, for the art by which Celebrimbor had wrought them was an art he had learned in long part from Annatar, even though Annatar's hand had not been upon them at their forging, even though Annatar's voice had not been heard in their craft. The underlying pattern of the craft itself was the pattern that Annatar had patiently taught, and so, as we shall see in the bitter hour when the one ring was at last forged, the three were not wholly outside its reach. They were not like the 16 made with Sauron's hidden mark woven into their metal, but they were of the same family of craft, of the same line of art. And so when the master ring of all rings was at last set upon Sauron's hand, the three knew it, and the bearers of the three knew it, and they understood at last what they had been complicit in. They put the three rings aside. They did not wear them. They did not dare. So long as Sauron held the one, the three lay hidden in their cases, untouched, unused, for fear that to use them was to give their bearers and their realms over to the slow searching gaze of the master. It was only later, dear listener, only in the late Second Age, and afterwards in the long Third Age, when Sauron had at last been thrown down upon the slopes of Orodruin, and the one ring had been cut from his hand and lost into the long current of the Anduin, only then did the bearers of the three dare to set them upon their fingers again. And even then, the lore tells us, they used them with great care, only for preservation and never for any working of dominion, and they did all their long, quiet labor through them with the knowledge that the one ring still existed somewhere in the world, and that should it ever return to its master, the three would be undone with it. But all of that, dear listener, lay still many long years in the future, on the day the three rings were finished in Celebrimbor's secret workshop. On that day, Celebrimbor looked upon his work and saw that it was very fair, and that it was, as far as he could make it, his own. He took the three rings, and he sent them away. He sent Narya into Lindon to Círdan the shipwright. He sent Vilya into Lindon to Gil-galad the High King, and Nenya he kept for a while, in his own keeping, intending to bestow it in due course upon Galadriel, who, you will remember, dear listener, had already departed Eregion in her unease over Annatar, and who would in due time receive Nenya and bear it eastward into the green lands that would become Lothlorien. The three were sent away. They were hidden, at first, from common sight. They were kept against the day, whose coming Celebrimbor did not yet know to fear when they might be needed. And it was at that point, dear listener, that Sauron in his hidden eastern fastness, Sauron in his slow patient forge upon the western flank of Orodruin, in the land that he had been quietly preparing through all the years of his teaching at Eregion, Sauron set himself at last to his own great work. He took into his secret forge the long lore he had drawn out of the Myrdain in their years of joint labor. He took the cunning he had taught them, and the cunning they had taught him in return. He took the small, invisible thread he had woven into every one of the 16 rings at their making, and he set himself to make a single ring greater than all of them, a ring into which he would pour so much of his own spirit that all the lesser rings, drawn by the small threads that ran from each of them, back to the master pattern of his craft, would be brought under its dominion. A ring that would rule them all, a ring that would find them, a ring that would, in the long darkness of the years to come, bring them all together and bind them. He went then to the heart of his own mountain. He went down into the deep chambers of Orodruin, where the slow river of fire that fed the mountain ran closest beneath the floor of the world. He kindled there a forge whose flame was not the flame of any earthly fire, but a portion of the deep fire of the mountain itself drawn up through the stone. And he set himself to the long labor of the One Ring. But that, dear listener, is the next part of our tale, and we shall come to it in due time. For now, let us pause for a moment and consider what we have seen. We have seen, dear listener, the long, patient design of a spirit who had been once the brightest of his master's apprentices, and who had become, by a long, slow drift across many ages, the most patient of all the dark powers of the world. We have seen him clothe himself in fair form and walk into the bright forges of the elves, and there, by the giving of gifts and the sharing of craft, weave his slow hidden thread into the work of their hands. We have seen the smiths of Eregion labor in good faith and bring forth the 16 rings of the dwarves and of mortal men. We have seen Celebrimbor, in his quieter wisdom, hold back at the last and make 3 more by his own hand, and without the disguised Maya's touch. We have seen Annatar perceive that, holding back, smile, and withdraw to his own dark mountain, to make a ring that would, in the long event, undo all the others. And we stand now, dear listener, at the very threshold of the One Ring's making. Let us pause here, draw a slow breath, and gather ourselves for the next part of the road. For what comes next is the heart of the long tale, the secret forging in the deep of Orodruin, the open war of the elves and Sauron that the forging at once unleashed, the great alliance of the West that gathered at the end of the Second Age to throw the Dark Lord down, and the long, bitter chance by which the One Ring, instead of being unmade in the fire that had given it being, was carried away into the long centuries of the Third Age to wait for its slow road home. Now we must go down, dear listener, into the deep dark of Orodruin and stand for a while at the secret forge in which the One Ring was made. For this was the heart of Sauron's long design, the thing for which all the long apprenticeship at Eregion had been the patient preparation, the work toward which every smile and every fair word and every gift of craft had been bent, and it was a work that, in its making, would for the first time put forth into the open the Dark Lord whose long disguise had until then concealed him. Orodruin, the mountain of fire, which the elves afterwards called Amon Amarth, the mountain of fate, was no quiet hill. It stood alone upon the high plateau of Gorgoroth, ringed about by the 3 great mountain walls that fenced in the land of Mordor, the arid Lithui to the north, the Ephel Duath to the west and south. It was a tall cone of black ash and broken stone, and within its hollow heart there ran a slow river of fire that fed up out of the deep places of the world. The smoke of it could be seen for many leagues in every direction, a slow, dark plume against the bright sky, and the very air about it was bitter with the breath of its inner furnace. Sauron had chosen this place, dear listener, for reasons both practical and symbolic. Practically, the deep fire of the mountain gave him a forge whose heat no other forge in Middle-earth could match, a heat so high and so pure that it could be used to draw out of metal a portion of the spirit of its maker, in a way no earthly fire could ever do. Symbolically, the mountain was a thing of the deep earth itself, of the long, slow elemental energies that ran beneath all the lands, and to set his forge in such a place was to set it in communion with those energies, to bind whatever he wrought there to the long, deep heartbeat of ardor itself. He did not choose the mountain for its terror. He chose it for its power. He went down into the inner chambers of the mountain alone. He brought no servant with him into the deepest of the chambers, the one in which the One Ring would be made, for he did not wish any other witness to its making. He carried only the small store of materials he would need, a portion of gold so pure that no impurity could be detected in it by any test he knew, a small set of tools of his own making, the cunning he had drawn out of the Myrdain in their long years of joint labor, and the long patient pattern of his own will which he had been refining through all the silent years of his hiding. And then, dear listener, he began, the law does not give us the duration of the making in any clear count of years, but the lawmasters who have considered the matter most carefully reckon that the forging of the One Ring took perhaps a full year of slow patient labor, perhaps a little more. Sauron worked alone, in the deep heat of the mountain, day after day after day, while the long history of Middle-earth ran on above him without knowing what was being made beneath. He drew out the gold. He set it into the form of a simple band, a ring of perfect circular plainness, with no jewel upon it, with no decoration at all upon its outer surface, with no mark to distinguish it from the simplest of wedding rings, of the simplest of mortal smiths. Its plainness, dear listener, was deliberate. He wished it to be a thing that could be hidden in plain sight, that could be slipped onto a finger without remark, that could be carried in a pocket for years and never noticed. And so the master ring of all rings, the most dangerous small thing in all of Middle-earth, was made to look exactly like the least remarkable ring in the world. But within the plain gold, dear listener, he set inscriptions of a craft no other smith would ever have been able to read. He set them into the very substance of the metal, woven into its inner lattice, invisible to the eye and undetectable to the touch, except that when the ring was heated, the inscriptions came forth in lines of fire upon its surface, glowing red and clear, written in the script of the elves, but in the speech of Mordor. The words of the inscription were these, set as the master inscription that bound all the lesser rings to the master ring. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all together, and in the darkness to bind them. These words, dear listener, were not poetry. They were not for show. They were the operating principle of the thing. They named in the most concise possible form the four functions the one ring was to perform: to rule, to find, to bring together, to bind. Every other property the ring would later display flowed from one of those four. And into the ring, dear listener, Sauron poured himself. This is the deep, strange thing about the one ring that the law presses upon us with great care, and that we must understand if we are to understand anything else about it. Sauron did not merely make the ring as a craftsman makes a tool. He did not merely fold a portion of his will into it, as he had taught the Myrdain to fold their wills into the lesser rings. He poured into the one ring a vast portion of himself, of his very being, of the spirit substance of which a Maya is made, of the strength and the cunning and the long patience that had been his since the days of Owl's workshop. He emptied himself into it. He made the ring not a thing apart from himself, but a vessel that held a great portion of his selfhood, a thing that was, in a sense, the law insists upon, the same thing as he was held in two places. This pouring in, dear listener, was a great wager. It was the kind of wager that only a being of immense confidence in his own future would have made, for by pouring so much of himself into the ring, Sauron bound his own fate to the ring's keeping. So long as the ring endured, he could not be wholly destroyed. Even if his body were thrown down, even if the form he wore in the world were broken, his spirit would endure, because so much of it was held safely within the ring. And from that small bright remnant, he could in time gather himself again and rebuild. But by the same token, so long as the ring endured outside his own hand, he was diminished, halved, weakened, slowed. He could not put forth his full power. He had to gather and to scheme and to send out his thought upon dark winds in search of what was his. And if the ring were ever, by any chance, by any will greater than his, by any fire hotter than the fire of any earthly forge, unmade, then he too would be unmade in the same hour, and his long labor would come at last to nothing. He believed in the proud confidence of his making, that no such chance could ever come about. He believed that no will would ever stand against his with sufficient strength to take the ring from him. He believed that no fire in Middle-earth could match the fire of his own forge, save the fire of Orodruin itself, and that no creature would ever bring the ring back to the very mountain in which it had been made. He was, in this last belief, wrong by a margin no Maya had ever before been wrong in any reckoning, but the wrongness lay still 3,000 years in the future on the day he poured himself into the ring. And so, dear listener, the one ring was finished. Sauron took it from the forge. He held it in his hand. He felt, in the moment of its completion, the small new presence of his own spirit looking back at him out of the gold, a strange and slightly unsettling sensation even for him, the sense of being two places at once, of seeing himself through his own eyes and through the eyes of the ring at the same time. He set the ring upon his finger. He drew himself up to his full stature in the deep chamber, and at the same moment, dear listener, far away in Eregion, every elf who wore one of the three rings felt a sudden cold thrill pass through their hearts. They did not yet know what they had felt, but Gil-galad knew, Galadriel knew, Celebrimbor in the workshops of Ostin-Edhil knew at once and most terribly, for the master pattern had just been set, and the lesser rings, including, alas, the three, had each felt the small new pull of the master upon their own hidden threads. Celebrimbor, dear listener, understood in that moment everything that had been done to him. He understood, with a clarity that came perhaps too late, that the gracious stranger who had spent 100 years in his workshop had been working all that time toward this exact hour. He understood that the 16 rings, which he had thought were gifts of friendship and preservation, had been wrought as the instruments of an enslavement he had not perceived. He understood that even the three, which he had made alone and in secret, were bound by the deeper underlying art of their craft to the master ring, whose making he had just felt. He understood, in short, that he had been the chief instrument of the greatest treachery that had been worked upon the elves of Middle-earth since the rebellion of Fëanor itself. The shame of it, the lore tells us, was almost more than he could bear. But he was a smith, dear listener, and a captain of smiths, and shame is not the kind of feeling that the smiths of his line indulged for long. He acted. He sent at once to Gil-galad in Lindon with word of what had happened, and with the three rings that had been in his and his herald's keeping, Vilya for the High King himself, and Narya for Círdan at the Grey Havens. He sent likewise to Galadriel beyond the mountains, with Nenya, the third of the rings, for her keeping in the green lands she had made her dwelling. He sent these three rings out of Eregion that they might at least be hidden from Sauron's immediate reach, that the master pattern might find them only at very great distance, and so be hindered from drawing them home. As for the 16, Celebrimbor had not yet given them out. They were still in his own keeping, in their cases, in the deep vault of Ostin-Edhil. He resolved to defend them, to refuse Sauron the open recovery of them by any means short of fire and steel. And Sauron, dear listener, came for them. The forging of the One Ring had revealed his open enmity at last, and there was no longer any need to keep up the pretense of Annatar. He threw off the fair form he had worn in Eregion, though by all later accounts he could still take a fair form when it suited him, even after his open declaration, and he gathered a great army out of the eastern and southern lands he had been quietly preparing through all the years of his disguise, and he marched west and north across the wide miles toward Eregion. The war that followed, dear listener, the lore calls the War of the Elves and Sauron. It lasted some 7 years from the first muster of Sauron's host to the final ruin of Eregion, and it was by any reckoning a war the elves of the west were ill-prepared to fight. Gil-galad in Lindon had been wary, as we have said, but his armies were far away across many leagues of country, and the road between Lindon and Eregion ran through the long, wild miles of Eriador that no elven host had patrolled in those days. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm sent what aid they could, sallying out of their gate to harry Sauron's flank as he came up against Eregion, but they were not enough. Eregion stood alone for most of the war, and Eregion fell. The end of Eregion came, dear listener, in a single terrible season. Sauron's host broke the long defending line of the Myrdain along the outer marches. They came on through the Hollywoods, burning as they came. They came at last to the walls of Ostin-Edhil itself. They stormed the city. Celebrimbor stood at the last upon the threshold of his own workshop, defending with his own hand the door behind which the 16 rings had been hidden. He was taken, in the end, alive. Sauron tortured him. The lore is careful with the details, but it tells us that he was tortured at great length and with great patience, that Sauron wished above all things to recover the 3 rings, for he had perceived that they were the ones that had been hidden from him, and they were the ones his master pattern could not so easily call home, and he desired them above all the others. Celebrimbor, the lore tells us, gave up at last the knowledge of where the 9 had been kept. The 7 also, he confessed, were where where they had always been, in the vault of Ostin-Edhill, but the three he refused to name. He died, the lore tells us, without saying a word about where Vilya or Narya or Nenya had been sent. His body, the lore tells us, with the kind of detail it usually withholds, was afterwards used by Sauron as a banner, pierced with arrows, hung upon a pole, carried before his host as a sign of what awaited any who would defy him further. So ended Celebrimbor, the grandson of Fëanor, the last of the great elven smiths of the elder line. Eregion itself was destroyed. The city of Ostin-Edhill was thrown down. The Holly Woods were burned. The Myrdain, who survived the storming, were scattered. Some fled north to Lindon, to Gil-galad. Some fled east through the high pass and into the keeping of the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and afterwards onward to the green valleys beyond. Some fled south. The land of Eregion, dear listener, was never again inhabited by the elves. For all the long ages that followed, it lay empty. The lanes of Ostin-Edhill grew over with grass. The forges cooled. The bright workshops of the Myrdain became the dwelling of beasts and afterwards of nothing at all. When at last, 3,000 years afterwards, a small company of travelers passed through that land on the long road south toward Mordor, all that remained of Eregion was a thin line of holly trees still standing in odd patterns where the old roads had been, and the long memory of what had once been there, and even that memory by then was carried by only a few. Sauron took the 16 rings out of Eregion, and he took them back to his dark tower, and he gave them out at his own pleasure. The 7 he gave to the 7 dwarven lords, perhaps believing that they would serve him as the 9 would, and learning only after the fact that the dwarves' stubborn nature would not bear the wraithing that he had intended. He recovered the 7 slowly across the long centuries, as we have already told, drawing some by his own hand, and losing others to dragonfire. The 9 he gave to the 9 great mortal men he had chosen for his purpose, and these 9 he held firm. They became the Nazgûl. They were his most faithful and most enduring servants for all the long ages that followed. And the three he could not find, the 3 remained with the elves, Vilya in Lindon with Gil-galad, Narya at the Grey Havens with Círdan, Nenya in the green lands beyond the mountains with Galadriel. They lay hidden, untouched, unused. So long as Sauron held the one, they could not be used at all without giving themselves and their bearers away. And so the 3 slept and waited. But Sauron, dear listener, was not content with what he had won. He had recovered the 16, and he had ruined Eregion, and he had set the 9 wraiths into the world as his servants. But he had not gathered all the rings under his master pattern, as he had hoped. The 3 were still beyond him. The elves of Lindon and of the green lands still stood. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm still held their gate. The men of Númenor, who in those years were a great and growing power, had not yet been brought into his reckoning at all. And so he turned, after the fall of Eregion, to the rest of Middle-earth, and he set himself to bring it all under his hand. The long centuries that followed, dear listener, are the long middle of the Second Age, and we shall pass over them briefly, for they are not strictly the story of the rings themselves, but the story of the long struggle that the rings had set in motion. Sauron made himself, in those centuries, the open lord of all the lands east and south of the elven realms. He took the title Lord of the Earth, a title that he had no right to bear, for the Lord of the Earth, if any being might bear such a title, was Manwë upon the heights of Taniquetel in Valinor. But he took it nonetheless, and he gathered to himself the long obedience of many mortal peoples. He warred upon Gil-galad. He pressed slowly westward, and Gil-galad held the line at the river Lun with the help of the men of Númenor, who had begun in those years to send great fleets eastward to the aid of their elven kin. And here, dear listener, the Númenorians enter our tale, for they are the people from whom Isildur came. And Isildur is the man whose hand at the very end of the Second Age cut the one ring from Sauron's finger. The Númenorians were the high race of mortal men, raised up by the Valar after the wars of the First Age and given the great star-shaped island of Númenor in the Western Sea as their dwelling. They were tall and long-lived, 3 times the span of common mortal men, or somewhat more, and they were great seafarers and great craftsmen, and in their early generations, great friends of the elves. It was their fleets, sent eastward at Gil-galad's call, that broke at last Sauron's first great push into the west. Sauron was driven back. The men of Númenor harried his armies. They drove him out of Eriador entirely, and in time, in a thing the law reckons, among the great strange ironies of its long telling, the king of Númenor himself, Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, came east in such overwhelming force that Sauron's own host would not stand to face him, and Sauron, in his cunning, surrendered himself willingly into Ar-Pharazôn's hands, allowing himself to be taken back to Númenor as a prisoner. What followed in Númenor, dear listener, is a tale we shall not tell at length tonight, for it is its own great tale and deserves its own evening. It is enough to say that Sauron, brought to Númenor as a prisoner, in a few short years became the king's most trusted counselor, then his high priest, then the true master of the island in all but name. He turned the men of Númenor away from their old reverence for the Valar and toward the worship of Melkor, his old dark master. He persuaded Ar-Pharazôn at last to do the unthinkable, to sail west with a great armament and invade the undying lands themselves, to wrest immortality from the Valar by force. And the Valar, in their grief at what their long-loved Númenorians had become, laid down their guardianship and called upon Ilúvatar himself to act. And Ilúvatar, dear listener, the one who had not intervened in the affairs of Arda since the very beginning. Ilúvatar broke the world. He drowned Númenor beneath the western sea. He bent the shape of the world from flat into round, so that the straight road to Valinor was sundered from the seas of mortal men forever. Only a small remnant of the faithful, led by Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion, escaped the drowning. They sailed east on 9 ships, driven by storm, and made landfall upon the western shores of Middle-earth, where they founded the realms of Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south. Sauron, dear listener, was caught in the drowning of Númenor. His fair form, the form he had worn through all his years on the island, was destroyed in that ruin. He returned to Middle-earth as a wisp of spirit upon the dark winds, and it took him long years to gather himself again into any bodily form. But the one ring, which he had kept all along, was not destroyed in the drowning. It had remained perhaps in some hidden chamber of his fortress on the island that the great waters did not reach, or perhaps about his person in some way that the law does not specify. It returned with him, and when at last he gathered himself again into a body, dear listener, the body he wore was no longer fair. He could no longer take a fair form. The drowning of Númenor had robbed him of that capacity forever. He came back into Middle-earth as the Dark Lord we know from the lore, terrible and tall, hideous of countenance, the long beauty of Mairon, gone forever. He returned to Mordor. He gathered his old servants, including the 9 wraiths who had waited patiently for him through the centuries. He began at once to prepare for the next stage of his great war. And the heirs of Elendil, dear listener, Elendil himself, his son Isildur, his son Anarion, they too prepared for war. They knew, for they had seen Sauron at work in Númenor and had not been deceived. They built their 2 kingdoms in the north and the south. They built mighty, white-walled cities. They built fortresses to watch the borders of Mordor, and they sent messengers north to Gil-galad in Lindon, and the High King of the Elves and the High King of the men in exile took counsel together, and they swore upon their 2 great spears that they would together cast Sauron down before he could rise to his full strength again. And so was formed, dear listener, the last alliance of elves and men. The mustering of the last alliance was a great thing. It was the gathering of every free people of the West who would answer the call. Gil-galad sent the host of the Noldor out of Lindon under his own banner. Elendil led the men of Arnor and Gondor out of their 2 new kingdoms. Elrond, the herald of Gil-galad, came with his own company. Círdan came out of the Grey Havens. Even some of the sylvan elves of the eastern forests, under their king Oropher, who was Thranduil's father, came to the muster. And at this point, dear listener, the lore notes a small, sad detail, that the sylvan elves did not heed the High King's counsel as well as they might have done, and so they suffered greater losses in the first great battle than the better armoured Noldor of Lindon. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm did not come, but they did not stand against the muster either. They kept their gate, and let the host pass through their lands without hindrance. The great host marched south. They mustered at last on the wide plain of Dagorlad, the battle plain which lay before the gates of Mordor. And there, dear listener, in the year 3434 of the Second Age, was fought the great battle of Dagorlad. The hosts of Sauron came forth from the gates of Mordor in numbers beyond reckoning, orcs and trolls and evil men and great beasts of the south and east. The hosts of the last alliance met them in the open. The battle lasted many days. It is reckoned among the greatest battles of all the long history of Middle-earth, comparable only to the great battles of the First Age in Beleriand. The host of the last alliance prevailed. They drove the armies of Mordor back through the Black Gate. They came up to the very walls of Barad-dûr itself, and there, dear listener, the long siege began. The siege of Barad-dûr, dear listener, lasted 7 years. 7 long years the elven and mannish hosts sat before that black tower, suffering the constant sallies of Sauron's forces, the long dark winds out of the mountain, the slow attrition of every season of war. Anarion, Isildur's brother, was slain in the 7th year by a great stone cast down from the tower, and at last in the 7th year Sauron himself came forth out of the tower and went up into the high battle. He had not done so until then. He had let his lieutenants bear the long brunt of the siege, but the long stalemate had worn upon him, and at the last he himself came forth to break the host of the west. The battle at the slopes of Orodruin, dear listener, was the climactic battle of the Second Age. Gil-galad and Elendil met Sauron in single combat upon the steep flank of the mountain. They had with them their 2 great heirloom weapons, Aeglos, the spear of Gil-galad, whose long white blade no shield of Sauron's making could turn aside, and Narsil, the long bright sword of Elendil. The combat was terrible. Gil-galad was burned to death by the heat of Sauron's hand, which even through the spear shaft consumed him. He fell, the last high king of the Noldor in Middle-earth, and the long line of Finwë came to its end with him. Elendil was thrown down by Sauron and broken. He fell upon his own great sword Narsil, and the sword was shattered in the fall into 2 long bright shards. So fell, dear listener, the high king of the men of the west, and the last high king of the elves of Middle-earth, both in the same hour, both at the hand of the Dark Lord himself. But Isildur, Elendil's son, didn't fall. He stood beside his father's broken body. He took up the hilt of Narsil with the longer of the 2 broken shards still set into it. He stood alone against Sauron, and with that broken shard, dear listener, he cut the one ring from Sauron's hand. The blade did not strike the ring directly. Rather, it cut through the finger upon which the ring was set, severing the Dark Lord's hand at the joint. The ring fell. Sauron, his body's life bound to the ring as it was, lost in that moment the substance of his form. His body collapsed. His spirit fled away as a great black smoke upon the dark wind, eastward over the mountains into the long hiding it would keep for the next 2,500 years. The dark armies, leaderless now, broke and fled. The siege of Barad-dûr was lifted. The Second Age came at last to its end. And Isildur, dear listener, Isildur, who had stood alone against the Dark Lord and prevailed, who had taken the one ring from Sauron's own hand, Isildur did the thing that, in the long sad reading of the lore, has caused him to be reckoned the second great failure of the Rings of Power, behind only Celebrimbor's own admission of Annatar into Eregion in the first place. Isildur kept the ring. He went down with the ring upon his hand from the slopes of Orodruin to where his father Elendil's body lay. He took up the broken shards of Narsil, both halves of the sword, and bore them away as the heirloom of his line. He returned to the host of the Alliance at the foot of the mountain. And there, dear listener, Elrond and Círdan, the 2 who stood now as the chief counsellors of the elves with Gil-galad fallen, pressed upon him with great urgency that the ring should be unmade in the very fire that had given it being. The cracks of doom lay only a short walk away, just up the slope of the mountain. The fire was hot enough. The hour was right. The thing could be done. They begged him. He refused. The lore tells us, dear listener, that Isildur refused for a reason he believed to be just, that the ring was, in his mind, a weregild for the deaths of his father Elendil and his brother Anarion, a payment owed to the House of Elendil for the great hurts they had received in the war. He claimed it as such. He set it upon his own finger, after wrapping it in a small cloth and bearing it carefully home down the mountain. He carried it with him north through the wide lands of Middle-earth, on the long road back to his own kingdom of Arnor. He did not in those first days of his bearing perceive the ring's deep working upon him. He was a man of great strength of will, the eldest son of Elendil, a king in his own right, and the ring did not master him at once as it would have mastered a weaker bearer. But the lore tells us with quiet care that even on Isildur he was beginning to take effect, slowly, as a long, slow current bends even the strongest swimmer at last. Had he lived long enough, dear listener, even Isildur would in time have been mastered. He did not live that long. For Isildur, dear listener, fell to ambush on the long road north. He had taken the road that ran up the eastern side of the Anduin, through the fields just south of the place where the Gladden River ran into the great river. He had only a small company with him, perhaps 200 soldiers, perhaps somewhat fewer, and as they passed through those fields, a band of orcs out of the misty mountains, who had perhaps been drawn down out of their high lairs by the call of the One Ring itself, fell upon them out of the rough ground in great numbers. The fight was a short one. Isildur's small company was overwhelmed. Isildur himself, knowing the battle was lost, and that the ring above all else must not be taken, set it upon his finger, and so became invisible to his attackers. He plunged into the deep cold waters of the Anduin, and tried to swim away under cover of his invisibility. But the One Ring, dear listener, did not wish to be carried away by Isildur. It had been parted from its master only some 2 years before, and the long pull of its master's distant will was still strong upon it. It slipped from Isildur's finger in the cold water of the river, perhaps drawn off by the current, perhaps by some small slow working of its own intent. And in that moment Isildur became visible again. The orcs upon the bank saw him as he came up out of the water. They shot him with their arrows. 3 arrows took him through the body. He fell back into the water and sank. So ended Isildur, the man who had taken the One Ring from Sauron's hand and failed to unmake it, lost in the cold, dark waters of the great river, with the ring slipped from his finger and lying somewhere in the silt of the riverbed, not far from his sinking body. The Gladden Fields, dear listener, that is the name the lore gives to that place, after the Gladden flowers, the yellow water irises that grew along the river's edge in those reaches. The disaster of the Gladden Fields, the lore calls the ambush itself. It was a small battle in the great accounting of the wars of Middle-earth, but it was an enormously consequential one, for from it the One Ring passed out of the keeping of any king or any captain and lay down quietly in the deep silt of the Anduin to wait. It waited there, dear listener, for 2,460 years. That is a number worth pausing on. 2,500 years. Whole peoples rose and fell in the lands above, while the ring lay still in the silt of the river. The northern kingdom of Arnor, which Isildur had been returning to when he was slain, slowly weakened, and at last broke into 3 smaller kingdoms, which themselves slowly weakened, and at last fell to the long pressure of the Witch King of Angmar, who was, dear listener, in fact the chief of the 9 Nazgul, now serving his slowly regathering master in this slow, patient destruction of the old kingdoms of the men of the West. The southern kingdom of Gondor, which Isildur's nephews had inherited, kept its borders for a longer time, but slowly weathered and dwindled across the centuries, with great plagues and long wars and the failing of the royal line. Sauron's spirit, scattered after the fall of Barad-dûr, gathered itself slowly in the great dark forest east of the Anduin that men afterwards called Mirkwood, where it took shape as a being the wise called the necromancer of Dol Guldur, dwelling in a dark fortress in the south of that forest, slowly drawing the long shadow back upon the lands. The hobbits, a people we have not yet mentioned, settled at some point in those long centuries in the green country between the Brandywine and the far downs, which they named the Shire, and they lived there in their small holes and their small farms for many slow generations, untouched as yet by any of the long shadows that were gathering at the edges of their small, bright land. And the ring lay still in the silt. It might have lain there forever, dear listener, Had not the small, slow working of its own intent at last drawn it toward the surface? For the One Ring, you will remember, was not a passive thing. It was a vessel that held a portion of Sauron's own spirit, and that portion of spirit was, in its own quiet way, awake. It was wishing, slowly and patiently, to be found. It was wishing to begin its long, slow journey home. And so, in the year 2460 of the Third Age, the chance, or the slow design, dear listener, the law is careful to leave the matter ambiguous, came at last about by which the ring rose up out of the silt and back into the hands of a small living creature. The creature was a small fishing folk, of a kind related to the hobbits but living wilder and more primitive lives in the riverbanks of the Anduin and the lands round about. The fishing folk were not, the lore tells us, properly speaking hobbits. They were a related kindred, a small, slender people who lived by the river and ate fish and kept small, low boats and quiet, hidden ways. The one who found the ring was a young one of that folk, named Deagol. He had gone fishing with his cousin Smeagol upon a particular small, bright day. He had fallen from his boat into the water. He had sunk down to the bottom, for the fishing folk, despite their riverside life, were not great swimmers. And there, in the silt of the riverbed, his eye had been caught by a small bright glint. He had reached for it. He had brought it up out of the water and onto the bank. He had looked at it in the sunlight. It was a plain gold ring. What followed, dear listener, was the small dark hour in which the ring's long sleep ended and its long second life began. Smeagol, who had been waiting on the bank, came over to see what his cousin had found. He looked upon the ring, and in that moment the lore tells us the ring took hold of him with a force that bypassed his ordinary will entirely. He demanded it. He claimed it. He said that Deagol must give it to him as a birthday present, for it was Smeagol's birthday on that very day. Deagol refused. Smeagol set his hands upon Deagol's throat. He strangled his cousin. He took the ring. He hid the body in the river, and he walked home alone to the small village of the fishing folk with the ring in his pocket and the first of his many lies upon his tongue. That, dear listener, was the beginning of Smeagol's long ruin. He kept the ring secret at first. He hid it in his pocket, but he began to wear it from time to time. And when he did, he became invisible to his kin, and in that invisibility he learned the small private uses to which such a state could be put, listening at doors he should not have listened at, taking small things that did not belong to him, working small mischiefs that his folk could not trace back to him. His folk soon began to mistrust him. His grandmother, who was the matriarch of his small village, at last drove him out altogether. He went, with the ring upon his finger, into the high country away from his people. He climbed into the misty mountains. He found in their deep heart a small dark cave with a cold lake at the bottom of it, fed by some hidden underground spring. He went down into that cave. He stayed there. And there, dear listener, in the deep dark beneath the mountains, the long, slow corruption of Smeagol into Gollum proceeded across the centuries. The One Ring, as we have already said, did not bestow immortality upon mortal bearers as the Nine had done upon the Nazgul. It bestowed only an unnatural lengthening of their span, a slow stretching out of their years far beyond their natural compass, a stretching that was always also a thinning, a fading, a long, slow drawing down of self into shadow. Smeagol bore the ring for 500 years in the deep dark of the cave. He grew small, his skin grew pale and clammy, his eyes grew large and pale and luminous, his teeth thin to a few sharp points. His back hunched, his feet became wide and flat and almost web-like. He spoke less and less to anyone other than himself, and he spoke to himself constantly in a small, high, whispering voice that he split between two contending personalities, the small remnant of Smeagol that still remembered the sun and his grandmother and his cousin Deagol, and the dark, stronger Gollum that had grown up within him under the long working of the ring, named after the small, wet, swallowing sound he made in his throat when he hungered for fish or for the ring itself. He ate, in those centuries, blind fish from the cold lake, and the occasional unwary goblin who wandered too far from the main galleries of the goblin kingdom that had grown up in the mountain in the same long centuries. He hid the ring in a small recess upon a small island in the middle of the cold lake. He rowed out to it from time to time upon a small low boat he had made of bark and bone. He He took the ring out of its hiding place when he wished to walk invisible through the goblin tunnels in search of food. He returned it to its hiding place when he came back to his dark home. He did not, by the late centuries of his long bearing, ever set the ring upon his finger except at need. The ring had grown too heavy to bear constantly even by him. It had begun to wear him thinner than even he could endure. So he kept it and used it sometimes and called it his birthday present and his precious, and he lived alone in the deep dark with no companion but his own divided voice. And then, dear listener, in the year 2941 of the Third Age, 481 years after Smeagol had taken the ring from Diargol on the riverbank, a small, unexpected visitor came into Gollum's cave. The visitor was a hobbit of the Shire folk, a small, respectable bachelor named Bilbo Baggins, who had been carried far from his quiet home by a long and improbable journey we shall not retell at length tonight, though it is its own great tale, and we have told it on other evenings, and we may tell it again. It is enough to say, dear listener, that Bilbo had been swept up into a quest with 13 dwarves and a wizard, that the company had been captured by goblins in the high passes of the Misty Mountains, that Bilbo had become separated from his company in the dark of the goblin tunnels, and that he had stumbled by chance, or perhaps by something other than chance, into the lower passages, where in the dark his hand had closed upon a small cold thing that lay on the floor of a stone passage. He had put it absent-mindedly into his pocket. He had walked on, and so the One Ring, having waited 500 years in the deep dark for the moment of its next finding, had been picked up by a small, soft-footed hobbit who had no idea what it was. What followed, dear listener, was the famous encounter in the deep dark by the cold lake, the riddle game between Bilbo and Gollum, the small, slow contest in which each tried to outwit the other in the old hobbit game of asking riddles, while Gollum looked Bilbo up and down in the dark and slowly considered whether to eat him before or after the game was done. The story has been told 100 times by readers since Tolkien first set it down. We shall not retell it at length tonight. It is enough to know that Bilbo won the contest by a small accident, by asking a question that Gollum could not answer, namely what Bilbo had in his pocket, and that Gollum, upon going back to his island to fetch the ring with which he had intended to slay Bilbo in any case, discovered that the ring was gone. The truth came clear to him at once. He let out a great scream of grief and rage. He came in pursuit of Bilbo through the tunnels. Bilbo, taking flight, slipped the ring upon his finger in his panic, and so became invisible to Gollum's eye. He slipped past Gollum in the dark passage, and out at last into the daylight upon the eastern side of the mountains. He rejoined his company. He kept the ring. He told no one at first that he had it. And so the One Ring, dear listener, passed at last out of the deep dark beneath the misty mountains and back into the wider lighted world. It was carried now in the pocket of a quiet hobbit who had no thought of being its bearer and who did not yet know what manner of thing he carried. Bilbo would carry it for some 60 years afterwards, taking it home with him to the Shire when his great adventure was over, keeping it in a small carved chest in his quiet hole at Bag End, taking it out from time to time when he wished to slip past unwanted visitors or wander unseen among the hills. He grew strangely old upon it without seeming to age, for the slow stretching of years had begun in him as it had begun in Smeagol, though Bilbo was a kindlier bearer, with a gentler heart, and the ring's working upon him was slower and less dark. But it was working upon him, dear listener. The law is clear upon that. And the wizard Gandalf, who had known Bilbo since the day of the great unexpected party that had launched his earlier adventure, watched him grow strangely old and yet strangely unwithered over those 60 quiet years, and began at last to suspect what kind of ring it was that the small hobbit carried. He did not yet know for certain. He could not yet test the matter, but his suspicion grew, and he began the slow, patient inquiry by which, in time, he would prove the matter beyond all doubt. He travelled south to Gondor. He searched the long-buried scrolls in the archives of Minas Tirith. He found at last, in those archives, an account written by Isildur himself in the last days of his life, an account of the ring he had taken from Sauron's hand at Orodruin, an account that described the ring's plain gold band and the inscription that came forth in lines of fire when the ring was thrown into a flame. Gandalf knew then what he had to do. He returned in haste to the Shire. He had Bilbo bring out the small gold ring he had kept all those years. He had Bilbo cast it into the fire of his own hearth at Bag End. He waited until the metal had grown hot enough, and there, dear listener, upon the plain gold band, the inscription came forth in lines of fire, as Isildur had described. The script of the elves, the speech of Mordor, the four-line operating principle of the Master Ring. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all together, and in the darkness to bind them. Gandalf knew then, beyond all doubt, the ring that Bilbo had carried for 60 quiet years was the One Ring. The thing the wise had thought lost forever in the cold waters of the Anduin had been sleeping in a small carved chest in a quiet hole in a quiet hill in the heart of the Shire. And Sauron, in his slow regathering of strength in the dark fortress he had now reclaimed at Barad-dûr, had begun at last to perceive that the ring was somewhere in the west, and had begun his long search for it. And so, dear listener, the long second sleeping of the One Ring came at last to its end. The ring had been lost in the river. The ring had been kept in the cave. The ring had been carried in the pocket. The ring had at last been recognized in the small kitchen at Bag End for what it had always been, and the long road to its unmaking, the road we shall walk in the next part of our tale, could at last begin. Now we come, dear listener, to the long last road of the One Ring, the road that begins in the small green quiet of the Shire and ends in the red fire of Orodruin, the road that the lore reckons as perhaps the longest and most heart-burdened journey ever undertaken in all the history of Middle-earth. The road would be walked, in the event, by 2 small hobbits and not by any king or any great captain. The wise of the West would gather to set them upon it, and a fellowship of 9 would be formed to attend them upon its early miles, but the long final stretch would be walked only by the 2, by Frodo Baggins of Bag End, and by his gardener and friend Samwise Gamgee, who would not be parted from him for any reason that the long miles or the long hunger or the long darkness could conceive. But before that road could begin, dear listener, there was a long council. For when Gandalf had at last proved that the ring Bilbo had kept these 60 quiet years was the One Ring, the question of what was to be done with it could not be answered by any single mind. Gandalf himself, though a great power and one of the wise of the West, would not take the responsibility upon his own council. The matter was too great. It touched upon every people of the free world. It required the gathering of the wise of all those peoples to deliberate together upon what should be done. In the meantime, dear listener, there was the immediate matter of getting the ring out of the Shire. For Sauron's slow, searching gaze, which had until lately been fixed upon the broader question of where the ring might be in the wide world, was beginning to narrow upon Eregion. The Dark Lord had captured Gollum. Yes, Gollum, dear listener, had at last left his cave in the misty mountains some years before, drawn out by the long calling of the Master Pattern, wandering eastward in search of the ring he had lost. He had been caught at the borders of Mordor. He had been brought into Barad-dûr. He had been tortured. He had spoken 2 words under torture, 2 words that Sauron had drawn from him, Shire and Baggins. He had not known what those 2 words meant in Sauron's reckoning, for he himself did not know precisely where the Shire was, or that any creature named Baggins still lived. But Sauron, who had long memory and the long counsel of his servants, would know what they meant. He had sent forth, even as Gandalf was making his proof in Bilbo's kitchen, the 9 Nazgûl out of Mordor, riding upon their black horses, bearing the 4 words of their orders, to find the Shire, to find a creature named Baggins, to take whatever ring he had, and to bring it back to Mordor. And so, dear listener, Frodo Baggins, to whom Bilbo, departing the Shire some 17 years before in his quiet way, had left the small ring and the small inheritance and the small green hole at Bag End, Frodo, who was a quiet and bookish hobbit of middle years and no particular ambition, had to leave. He did not wish to leave, but Gandalf was urgent. Gandalf was indeed more urgent in those days than any of his friends had ever seen him. The Nazgûl were already in the Shire, or would be very soon, and the small green quiet of that land was no longer any defense against what was coming. Frodo set out, dear listener, with his friend Samwise Gamgee, Sam the gardener of Bag End, the steady young hobbit who had loved Bilbo's old tales and would not let Frodo go upon any road without him, and with two more close friends, Meriadoc Brandybuck and Peregrine Took, both of whom had wormed their way into the secret of the journey by their own gentle insistence and would not be turned aside. The four of them slipped out of Hobbiton in the small hours, leaving small misleadings behind them to confuse any pursuit, and walked east through the green hills of the Shire toward the Brandywine. They were pursued, the lore tells us, with quiet care, almost from the first night. The Black Riders were upon their trail. They saw the first of the riders sniffing at the very road they had walked only minutes before. They hid in a thicket. The rider passed. They walked on. They came in time to the small market village of Bree, on the great road that ran east and west across Eriador. There, in the common room of the inn called the Prancing Pony, they met a strange weather-worn ranger named Strider, who took them aside and revealed to them his true name and his true purpose. He was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the heir of Isildur, the long-hidden heir of the kings of Arnor and Gondor, the last of the line of Elendil in Middle-earth, the man whose ancestors had taken the broken shards of Narsil down from the slopes of Orodruin 3,000 years before. He had been waiting for them in Bree at Gandalf's instruction. Gandalf himself had been delayed by what the lore would only afterwards reveal, and Strider would lead them in the wizard's place along the long road east to Rivendell, the hidden valley of Elrond, where the council of the wise was to be held. The road from Bree to Rivendell, dear listener, was a hard one. The Black Riders were near them every mile. They walked the rough country off the main road. They slept in cold camps. They came at last to the high hill called Weathertop, a place of broken stone with the ruins of an old watchtower upon its crown. There, in the deep dark of a long night, the Black Riders fell upon them. Frodo, in his terror, put on the ring, for he had been carrying it as Bilbo had carried it, slipping it on at moments of fear. And in that moment of putting on, the chief of the Black Riders, the Witch King of Angmar, was able to see him clear in the unseen world, and was able to strike him with a long, thin blade whose tip broke off in his shoulder. The blade was a Morgul blade, a thing of dark craft, and the small shard that lodged itself in Frodo's flesh began at once to work its way inward toward his heart. Had it reached his heart, dear listener, Frodo would have become a wraith, small and faded, a creature in the unseen world like the Nine, bound forever to the Dark Lord whose servant had wielded the blade. The remaining journey to Rivendell was a long race against the working of that small shard. Strider drove the company forward through the wild country. They came at last to the ford of the Bruinen, where the river ran fast and high before the entrance to Elrond's hidden valley, and there the Black Riders caught them. And there Elrond, by a great working from his hidden house upstream, sent the river up in flood. At the precise moment the Black Riders entered it, and they were swept away, and their horses were drowned. The riders themselves, being already wraiths, and not properly creatures of the seen world, could not be drowned, but they were unhorsed and scattered, and the small company crossed the river and came at last, exhausted and bleeding, to Rivendell. At Rivendell, dear listener, Frodo lay in the house of Elrond for some days, while Elrond worked the long, delicate healing that was needed to draw the small shard of the Morgul blade out of his shoulder. He was, at the last, healed, though not wholly, for some hurts of that kind never wholly leave their bearer, and Frodo would carry the memory of that wound and the cold ache of it every autumn afterwards, for as long as he remained in Middle-earth. And when he was healed enough to rise from his bed, he came down into the great hall of Rivendell, where the council was gathered. The Council of Elrond, dear listener, was the gathering of the wise of all the free peoples of Middle-earth that had been called to consider what should be done with the One Ring. Elrond himself sat at its head. Elrond, who had been Gil-galad's herald at the last alliance, who had stood at Isildur's side when Isildur refused to cast the ring into the fire, who had carried the long memory of that refusal for 3,000 years, and could now at last hope to see it undone. With him were Gandalf, who had come at last to Rivendell after his own long delay, and his story of imprisonment by Saruman the White upon the high pinnacle of Orthanc is a tale we have told elsewhere, and shall not retell at length here. There was Aragorn, the heir of Isildur. There was Glorfindel, the great elf lord of Rivendell, who had ridden out to meet the company at the river. There was Boromir, the eldest son of the steward Denethor of Gondor, who had ridden the long road from the White City in search of the meaning of a dream that had been sent to him and to his brother. There was Legolas, the prince of the Wood Elves of Mirkwood, sent by his father Thranduil with news. There was Gimli, the dwarf, son of Gloin, of the kingdom under the Lonely Mountain. There were others, counselors and lawmasters, and messengers from many lands. They sat together for many hours. They told one another all that they knew. Gandalf told the long story of his pursuit of Gollum and of his suspicions of the ring. Elrond told the older parts of the tale, going back to the forging in Eregion and the war with Sauron in the Second Age and the Last Alliance and Isildur's refusal. Aragorn told of the long watching of the rangers in the wild. Boromir told of the long defense of Gondor against the slow eastward shadow. Glorfindel told of his ride to meet the company. The hobbits told of their journey from the Shire, and at last, when all the telling was done, the question that had brought them together had to be answered. What was to be done with the One Ring? Many counsels were urged, dear listener. Boromir, in the long pride of his line and the long pressure of his father's failing kingdom, urged that the ring be brought to Gondor and used in the defense of the White City, that with such a weapon Sauron might at last be cast down and the long shadow lifted from the lands. Elrond and Gandalf refused this counsel at once. The ring, they said, was no weapon for any free lord to wield. Its very nature was the dominion of one will over all others. Whoever took it up and used it would in time become another Dark Lord, perhaps worse than the first, for the new Dark Lord would begin without the long, slow weathering that had already worked upon Sauron. Others suggested that the ring be given to Tom Bombadil, the strange ancient power who dwelt in the old forest at the eastern edge of the Shire and seemed to be entirely untouched by the ring's calling. Gandalf refused this counsel also. Bombadil, he said, would not keep the ring well. He would forget it or grow weary of it, or set it down somewhere and not remember where, and in the end, Sauron would find it again. Others suggested that the ring be cast into the deep sea, but the sea was no longer, in the Fourth Age that was coming, an unbreachable barrier. In time, the powers that gathered would draw the ring up again, and the road back to dominion would be reopened. There was, in the end, only one counsel that all the wise could agree upon, and it was the hardest. The ring would have to be unmade, and the only fire in Middle-earth hot enough to unmake it was the fire of Orodruin itself, the fire in which it had been forged. The ring would have to be carried by some bearer or other, all the long miles east and south through wild country and through Sauron's own watched borders, to the very cracks of doom, and there cast into the river of fire that had given it being. There was no other way. And then, dear listener, the question came round to the matter of who should bear it. The wise looked upon one another in the long hall. Each of the great ones could feel, in their own heart, the small pull of the ring that lay upon the table before them. Each of them knew that to take it up was to be tested in a way that their wisdom and their strength had perhaps not been tested before. Galadriel, who was not present at the council but who would in due time be tested in her own way, said long afterwards that to be offered the ring was to face the slow opening of one's own heart's deepest longing. Gandalf would not take it. Elrond would not take it. Aragorn would not take it. Boromir, perhaps, would have taken it had it been offered, but it was not offered to him. And in that long pause, dear listener, the small voice of Frodo Baggins of the Shire spoke up out of the corner. "I will take the ring," he said, "though I do not know the way." He spoke quietly, almost as though he had not meant to speak at all, almost as though some other voice in him had spoken without his permission. But once the words were out, they could not be unsaid. Elrond looked at him for a long while in silence. He said at last that this was perhaps the appointed task of Frodo Baggins, that the hour of the halflings had come upon Middle-earth in a way the wise had not foreseen, and that no other hand at this table would be more fit for the bearing than the small hand of the hobbit Spirit who had spoken. He set Frodo to the task. He named to attend him a fellowship of 9, to match in number the 9 Nazgul who served the Dark Lord, 9 walkers against the 9 riders. The fellowship would be Frodo himself, his 3 companions out of the Shire, Sam and Merry and Pippin, Gandalf, Aragorn, Boromir, Legolas, and Gimli. They would set out from Rivendell when the season turned a little colder, and they would walk south along the spine of Middle-earth, and they would go as far together as their path allowed. They set out, dear listener, in the deep of the year, when the snows were already heavy upon the high passes. We shall not trace the early miles of their journey in great detail, for we have told them on other evenings. It is enough to say that they tried first the high pass of Caradhras over the misty mountains, and were turned back by a great storm whose making the wise believed was no natural weather, but the slow working of the will of the Dark Lord far off in his tower. It is enough to say that they tried then the lower road through Moria, through the deep dark halls of Khazad-dûm, where now no dwarven king ruled and a great dark thing of the elder days had taken up its dwelling. It is enough to say that they passed through Moria with great hardship, that they were beset by goblins in the long galleries, and that at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the great chasm at the heart of the dwarven kingdom, they met the dark thing itself, the Balrog of Morgoth, a fallen mire of fire and shadow that had slept in the deep places since the elder days, and had been roused at last by the slow delving of the dwarves. Gandalf stood upon the bridge against it. He broke the bridge beneath the Balrog's feet, but as the Balrog fell, its long fiery whip caught Gandalf about the knees and dragged him down with it into the abyss, and the wizard fell, calling to the company to fly on without him. Aragorn led the company out of Moria, dear listener, into the cold autumn light of the eastern side of the mountains. They wept for Gandalf. They mourned him. They thought him lost forever. And then, with no time for the long mourning he deserved, they pressed on east and south into the green eaves of Lothlorien, the golden wood where Galadriel and Celeborn ruled their long-preserved realm, beneath the slow, gentle virtue of Nenya. They stayed in Lothlorien for some weeks, though they did not know it was weeks, for the time of Lothlorien did not run as the time of the outer world ran, and the company felt themselves to be there only a few days when they emerged. They were given gifts and counsel by Galadriel and Celeborn at their parting. Frodo himself was given a small phial of light from the brightest of the stars, a small bright thing whose power he would have great cause to draw upon in days to come. They set out from Lothlorien in 3 small boats and floated down the great river Anduin, southward, toward the long approach to Mordor. They came at last, dear listener, to the falls of Rauros, where the great river plunged over a long high cliff into a foaming basin below. There, upon the western bank, the fellowship was at last broken. Boromir, who had been quietly tempted by the ring throughout the journey, came upon Frodo alone in the woods and tried to take the ring from him by force, pleading, then commanding, then at last reaching to seize it. Frodo, in his alarm, put on the ring and fled away. Boromir, when the ring left him and his mind cleared, was overcome with grief at what he had tried to do. He sought the company. He told them what had happened, and in the same hour, before they could decide what to do, a great band of orcs, Saruman's orcs, sent out from the White Wizard's tower at Orthanc, where Saruman had at last revealed himself as a traitor to the wise and a seeker after the ring on his own account, fell upon the company. Boromir died defending Merry and Pippin from the orcs. He fought to the last, slaying many, and was at last pierced through with many arrows, and died beneath a tall tree by the falls. Merry and Pippin were taken alive by the orcs and borne away westward. And Frodo, dear listener, in the small hour while the orcs were still circling the company, decided that the time had come for the heart of the journey. He took one of the small boats. He pushed it out into the river. He turned its prow toward the eastern bank, toward the long lands that led to Mordor. But he was not alone. Sam Gamgee, who had been watching for him with the steady patience of a gardener who watches a slow-growing plant, ran down to the bank as Frodo set out. He waded into the river. He nearly drowned. Frodo brought the boat about and pulled him in. The 2 hobbits, dear listener, crossed the river together and walked off into the eastern country and the long second half of the journey, the part of it that Frodo had perhaps known From the beginning he would have to walk alone, but for Sam began. The fellowship that remained, Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, bore Boromir's body in a small funeral boat over the falls of Rauros, sending him down the river to the sea as the men of Númenor of old had buried their dead. Then they set out west in pursuit of the orc band that had taken Merry and Pippin. Their part of the tale, dear listener, is the part that runs through Rohan and Helm's Deep and the Great War for the Kingdom of Men, and it is its own great tale, and we have told it on other evenings, and we shall touch upon it only as it relates to the ring itself. For while Aragorn pursued the orcs across the green plains of Rohan, while he met at last the resurrected Gandalf, for Gandalf had not been lost in his fall with the Balrog, dear listener. He had fought the Balrog through the deep places of the earth and slain it at last upon the peak of Zirac-Sigil, and had himself been sent back from the threshold of death by powers higher than himself, returned to Middle-earth as Gandalf the White to complete the task he had been given, while Aragorn and Gandalf rode together with Legolas and Gimli into Rohan, and helped the Horse-lords throw back the army of Saruman at Helm's Deep, while they rode on to Isengard and confronted the broken Saruman in his ruined tower, while they came at last to Minas Tirith, and Aragorn drew the broken sword, Narsil reforged as Anduril, the Flame of the West, and led the riders of the West to the battle of the Pelennor fields and the breaking of the great siege of the White City. While all of this was happening, the long road of Frodo and Sam was running its quieter and harder course through the dead and broken country of the East. Frodo and Sam, dear listener, came down out of the high ridge above the river and into the long stony hills called the Emin Muil, the broken country east of the Anduin. They wandered there for some days, lost, doubling back upon themselves, unable to find a way down out of the maze. And there, in the long, thin pinch of one of those nights, they at last caught the small wretched creature who had been following them all the way from Moria. They caught Gollum. Gollum, dear listener, had escaped from Sauron's prison some time after he had spoken his 2 words under torture. He had been hunting for the ring ever since. He had picked up the company's trail in Moria and had followed them down the great river, swimming in the dark beside their boats. And now, in the Emin Muil, he had thought himself near enough to make his attempt. Frodo and Sam caught him as he climbed down a rope end after them in the dark. Sam wished to slay him at once. Gollum was a danger and a thief and worse, and the journey would only become harder with him in it. But Frodo, dear listener, Frodo, in a small moment that the law presses upon us with great care, Frodo refused. He remembered something Gandalf had told him long before, in the small kitchen at Bag End, when Frodo had first asked why Bilbo had not slain Gollum in the cave when he had the chance. Gandalf had said that the pity of Bilbo, who had refused to slay Gollum out of mercy, might yet rule the fate of many. Frodo remembered those words. He looked at the wretched creature huddled at his feet. He set down his small elven sword. He bound Gollum's wrists gently with the elven rope from Lothlorien. He did not slay him, and so, dear listener, the small thread of mercy that had been begun in the dark beneath the mountains was passed forward another step. Gollum guided them, dear listener, through the long dead marshes east of the Emin Muil, the strange flat country full of standing pools of green water in which the dead faces of an ancient battle could be seen, drifting in the slow currents below the surface. He guided them across the bleak waste north of the Morannon, the great black gate of Mordor, where the ground was poisoned and nothing grew. He guided them south, around the edge of the dark land, to a long ridge of broken hills called the Ethel Duath, the shadow fence of Mordor. He brought them at last to the small hidden way up that ridge that no army of Mordor patrolled, a stair that climbed and turned and climbed again, up to a high pass at a place called Cirith Ungol, the Spider's Pass. He led them there because that was the only way into Mordor that did not run through the great gate. He led them there also, dear listener, because at the high pass there dwelt a great evil that he intended would do for him the work he could not bring himself to do directly. The evil was a great spider named Shelob, the daughter of an even older great spider that had drunk the light of the two trees in the elder days. Shelob lived in the deep tunnels of the pass. She fed upon any creature foolish enough to climb that way, and Gollum thought that if he led the hobbits into her tunnel, Shelob would slay them, and he could then quietly take the ring from their bodies and slip past her, for she had no interest in such small, dull metal things. The plan very nearly worked, dear listener. In the deep dark of Shelob's tunnel, Frodo was bitten by the great spider, bitten in the back of the neck, where the sting paralyzed him at once. He fell. Sam, who in that moment thought Frodo dead, took up Frodo's small elven sword, Sting, and the small phial of starlight Galadriel had given him, and stood alone against Shelob in the dark, and drove her off with great wounds, the bright phial held high before him as a small, unbearable star in her dim sight. She crawled away to nurse her hurts. Sam knelt beside his master. He believed him dead. He took, in his grief, the ring from around Frodo's neck, for the ring, in such a case, had to pass to some new bearer, who might at least try to carry it to its end. Sam, weeping, set out alone toward the high pass to continue the task. But Frodo was not dead, dear listener. Shelob's bite had only paralyzed him. It had not slain him. And before Sam had gone far, an orc patrol came upon Frodo's body in the tunnel, and Sam, hiding nearby, suddenly invisible because he had slipped the ring upon his finger to escape detection, heard the orcs speak of carrying the hobbit's body to the tower of Cirith Ungol, where the orc captain there would keep him until Sauron's questioning. Sam realized then that his master was alive. He went after the orcs in horror. He came at last to the gate of the tower of Cirith Ungol, alone, a small hobbit with a small sword and a small phial of light, set against a fortress full of orcs. And by a small grace that the law presses upon us, dear listener, a small grace that worked through the natural quarrels of orcs among themselves, and through the bright fear that the phial of starlight put into them, and through a great deal of small terrified hobbit courage that nothing in Sam's quiet life as a bag-end gardener had ever prepared him to find in himself, Sam went into the tower of Cirith Ungol alone, found his master in the topmost chamber, restored the ring to him, dressed him in cast-off orc armor for disguise, and walked out of the tower with him into the deep dark country of Mordor on the eastern side of the ridge. What followed, dear listener, was the long, terrible march across the dead plain of Gorgoroth to the foot of Orodruin. Frodo and Sam walked for many days through that bitter country. They had only such water as they had brought with them, and the country gave them no more. The streams were dry or poisoned with the smoke of the mountain. They had only such food as they had brought, and very little of that, only the small, thin elven waybread, the lembas, which sustained the spirit even when the body was failing. They moved by night when they could, hiding by day in small folds of the broken ground, dressing in their orc disguises whenever any patrol came near. The ring, in this final stretch of country, had grown heavier upon Frodo's neck than it had ever been before. He felt it as a great millstone, pulling his head down, dragging his every step. The very air about him was thick with Sauron's presence. The Dark Lord did not yet know where Frodo was, for Aragorn at this same hour was marching his small army of the west to the very gates of Mordor as a deliberate distraction, drawing Sauron's gaze away from the mountain, a gambit that was successful beyond reckoning, for Sauron was watching the gates and not the mountain, and Frodo and Sam slipped beneath his attention in the very heart of his land. But even unobserved, Frodo felt the ring's master near, and the ring's pull toward its master grew stronger with every step of the approach. He was failing. He could not have walked another day. Sam, by the last stretch, carried him bodily upon his back up the long slope of the mountain. They came at last, dear listener, to the door in the side of the cone of Orodruin, the same door by which Sauron had entered 3,000 years before to forge the ring. The door stood open. The chamber within ran with the red light of the deep fire. The narrow shelf of stone above the chasm, the small platform that the law calls the Samath Naur, the chambers of fire, ran out over the long, slow river of fire below. Frodo, with the last of his strength, walked out onto the shelf. Sam stood at the threshold behind him, weeping. And there, dear listener, in the very moment of his arriving, Frodo failed. He stood at the lip of the chasm with the ring in his hand. He drew breath. He prepared to cast it down. And he could not. His hand would not open. The ring spoke through him in that hour, not in words, but in the long, full voice of the will that had made it, near enough now to its master to draw the small hobbit will of its bearer completely under. Frodo turned. He looked at Sam standing weeping at the threshold. He said, in a voice that was not wholly his own, that he had decided otherwise. He would not do this. The ring was his. He set the ring upon his finger. He vanished from Sam's sight. And in that same moment, dear listener, two things happened at once. Far away in the high tower of Barad-dûr, the great eye, which had been bent westward upon Aragorn's army at the gates, turned at last with a vast and terrible alarm toward the mountain. Sauron knew in that instant what had been done, that the ring had returned to its master's reach not from the west, but from within his own land, that a small bearer had walked unseen across his entire kingdom, and was now standing within the very chamber in which the ring had been made, that the ring was claimed and worn and visible to Sauron's master pattern. The 8 Nazgûl who still remained, the Witch King having been slain at Pelennor by the Lady Éowyn of Rohan, were summoned in a single thought from the gates of Mordor. They mounted their black-winged beasts. They sped toward the mountain with the speed of a black storm out of a black sky. Had they reached it even a minute later than they did, the lore tells us, all would have been lost. Sauron's victory would have stood. The world we know would have ended. And in that same moment, dear listener, the second thing happened. Gollum, who had been following the hobbits all the way across Mordor in his small silent ways, who had been driven nearly mad with the nearness of the ring, who had attempted only minutes before to attack them on the very slopes of the mountain and had been beaten back by Sam. Gollum, in the moment of Frodo's vanishing, came rushing up through the door of the chamber. He fell upon the invisible bearer. There was a struggle in the red half-dark. Gollum, with his teeth, bit the ring finger from Frodo's hand. He took the ring. He held it up in his small, wet hands. He danced a small dance of triumph along the very lip of the chasm. He cried out the small, wretched words of his 500-year-long love, his precious, his birthday present. And in his dance, dear listener, his foot found the edge of the shelf. He overbalanced. He fell. He fell with the ring still clutched in his hands, the long bright fall of creature and ring together into the river of fire that had given the ring its first being. The fire of Orodruin, dear listener, was the only fire in Middle-earth hot enough to unmake what had been made there 3,000 years before. The ring, struck by the fire that had birthed it, melted in an instant. The master pattern collapsed. The vast portion of Sauron's spirit that had been held within the ring was loosed in a single great breath, scattering on the dark winds, dispersing forever beyond any gathering. Sauron, in his high tower, was undone. His body, which had been held together through the long years by the ring's keeping of his spirit, collapsed into nothing. His tower of Barad-dûr, which had been built with the ring's power woven into its very stones, shook and cracked and fell. The 8 Nazgûl, halfway between the gates and the mountain, dissolved in mid-flight. Their black robes and their black-winged beasts crumpled out of the air and fell as ash upon the ground below. The great gates of Mordor, before which Aragorn's small army had been engaged at the very moment of the unmaking, collapsed and broke. The orc host that had been about to overrun that small army faltered, then broke, then fled in every direction without thought or order. The whole long, dark working of the Dark Lord was undone in the space of a single breath, in the heart of his own land, by the long patient mercy of a small hobbit toward a creature who did not deserve it. Frodo and Sam, dear listener, were spared the destruction by the slow waking of the mountain itself. Orodruin, with the ring at last unmade, began to break apart in great roars and shudders. The shelf at the Samath Naur cracked, the chamber filled with smoke. But Frodo, his finger gone, his ring gone, the long bearing at last lifted from him, came back to himself. He looked at Sam. Sam took him up. They stumbled out of the chamber as it collapsed behind them. They came down the slopes of the mountain through the falling ash and the rolling smoke. They lay at last upon a small spit of high ground, surrounded on every side by the breaking and the burning, and they took one another's hands, and they prepared gently to die. They were not afraid. The thing they had come to do had been done. The road had reached its end. But they were not to die that day, dear listener. The great eagles of the north, summoned by Gandalf at the very moment of the ring's unmaking, came in over the broken plain. Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, and his brothers, the great eagles who had borne Gandalf himself off the pinnacle of Orthanc many months before. They circled the burning mountain. They saw the two small figures upon the rock. They descended through the smoke. They lifted Frodo and Sam in their great talons and bore them away from the ruin of Mordor, back across the broken country, back to the green fields of Ithilien on the western side of the mountains, where the host of the West was already gathering in slow disbelief at the sudden ending of the Dark Lord's power. And so, dear listener, the long road of the One Ring came at last to its end. The ring was unmade. The Dark Lord was undone. The three rings, the elven rings that had been hidden so long, lost the last of their virtue in the same hour and became, in the long Fourth Age that was now beginning, only fair ornaments and not powers. Lothlorien began at last to fade from its long-preserved summer into the slow seasons of the wider world. Galadriel set sail for the west from the Grey Havens within a few years of the ring's unmaking, taking Nenya with her. Vilya passed with Elrond at his own departing, some years afterwards. Narya passed with Gandalf, who took the long road home in the same ship as Elrond and Galadriel. The high firstborn of the elves departed Middle-earth at last, leaving the long Fourth Age to be the age of men, the age of the dominion of mortal kingdoms, the slow age in which all the small magics of the elder days were gathered up and taken home over the sea. Aragorn was crowned, dear listener, as the High King of the reunited kingdoms of Arna and Gondor, the first to bear that title since Elendil himself 3,000 years before. He took the name Elisar, the Elfstone. He married Arwen, the daughter of Elrond, the last of the elven brides of mortal kings. He ruled long and well, and the lands of men flourished under his hand for many years. Frodo and Sam, dear listener, returned home to the Shire. They found, alas, that the small green quiet of their own land had not entirely been spared the long shadow of the war. Saruman, broken and turned out of his tower, had come north with his last servants, and set himself up briefly as a small tyrant in the Shire, cutting down old trees and building ugly mills, and breaking the small green peace of the place. Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin, returning, gathered the hobbits, and threw Saruman out in a brief, sharp scouring of the Shire. Saruman was slain in the end by his own servant Wormtongue at the very door of Bag End, and that, the lore tells us with quiet care, was the last small ending of the long War of the Ring. Sam married, dear listener, the small hobbit maid Rosie Cotton, whom he had loved before the journey began. He raised many children. He served as mayor of the Shire for many terms. He grew old gently and in honor, surrounded by all the small green peace he had fought to preserve. Frodo, alas, could not stay. The 4 wounds he had taken in the long journey, the Morgul blade at Weathertop, Shelob's sting in the tunnel, the loss of the finger at the Samath Naur, and the slow inward wound of having borne the ring at all, would not wholly heal in the world that remained. He sailed at last with Bilbo, who was very old and very tired, in the company of Elrond and Galadriel and Gandalf, from the Grey Havens west into the true west, to the undying lands, where the long hurts that no mortal medicine could heal might at last be eased. Sam stood upon the quay and watched the white ship sail away across the still water of the bay, and he wept, and then he turned, and he went home through the long evening to the round green door of Bag End, where his wife and his small daughter were waiting for him, and he sat down by the fire, and he said the 3 small words that the lore preserves as the final words of the long tale. "Well," he said, "I'm back, and so, dear listener, we come at last to the small reflection that this long tale invites us to. What were the rings of power in the deep reading of Tolkien's myth? What was the one ring in the heart of that same myth? They were not, as we said at the beginning, magic in any cheap modern sense. They were vessels, They were vessels into which their makers had poured their longings. The elves longing to keep fair things fair against the slow current of time, the dwarves longing to multiply their treasures, the mortal men's longing to escape mortality, and Sauron's deeper longing, deepest of all, to order every leaf and every river and every hearth into the single tidy pattern of his choosing. And the long lesson of the rings, told slowly across the 3 ages, is that every such longing, however lovingly held in the heart of the longer, becomes at last an instrument of dominion if it is given a vessel strong enough to carry it. The desire to preserve becomes the refusal to let go. The refusal to let go becomes the binding. The binding becomes the long, slow ruin of the very thing the binder once loved. Tolkien wrote, dear listener, in his letters and in his quieter moments outside the great tale, that the deepest meaning of the rings was not about evil power, but about the renunciation of power. The free peoples of Middle-earth saved themselves not by taking up the great weapon and turning it against the Dark Lord, but by refusing to take it up at all, by carrying it slowly and patiently to the only place where it could be unmade, and there letting it be unmade by an accident of mercy that was greater than any of them had planned. The elves at the end of the 3rd age chose to let go of the 3 rings, and so chose to let go of their long preservation of the elder world, and so chose to let the world become at last what it was meant to become, a world of mortal change, of seasons that ran their course, of small lives that came and went, of beauty that was beautiful precisely because it did not last. The choice to let go, the lore tells us with quiet care, was the truest victory of the War of the Ring. The casting of the ring into the fire was only the visible outward sign of the deeper inward choice. And the small mercy, dear listener, the small mercy that ran like a quiet thread through all the long years of the ring's journey. Bilbo's mercy upon Gollum in the cave beneath the mountains, Frodo's mercy upon Gollum in the Amin Muil, Faramir's mercy upon Gollum in the hidden waters of Henneth Anon, Sam's mercy upon Gollum at the foot of the mountain on the very last night. That mercy was the thing that did, at the end, what no greatness or strength of will could have done. Frodo, at the lip of the chasm, failed. The ring claimed him. He could not let it fall. But Gollum was there in that hour, alive in that hour, only because of the long thread of mercy that had spared him at every earlier hour. And Gollum did the thing that Frodo could not do, and the ring was unmade. The whole of the tale, dear listener, hangs upon that small, unrepaid kindness. The whole of Middle-earth was saved not by power but by mercy, not by greatness but by the long, patient kindness of one small hand toward a creature who did not deserve it. That is the lesson Tolkien set at the heart of his great myth. That is the lesson that the Rings of Power, in all their long, dark working, were finally made to teach. Let us linger, dear listener, upon the deeper symbolism of the rings. Tolkien himself, in many of the letters he wrote in the long years after the great book was finished, returned again and again to what the Rings of Power were for. They were, he wrote, the chief instrument by which his myth examined what he called the great machine, the impulse to control the natural world by greater and greater technical power, to bend the long, slow seasons of growth and decay to the convenience of the controller, to turn the world from a place to be lived in into a thing to be managed. The rings were the symbolic instruments of every kind of binding, of every kind of refusal to let the world be what the world by its own nature wished to be. The elves' 3 rings in this deeper reading were the longing to preserve, the longing to hold a particular fair moment of the world out of the slow current that would otherwise have carried it on. That longing, Tolkien said quietly, was not in itself an evil longing. It was a longing he understood from his own heart. He himself had felt it every time he saw an old wood cut down or an old village paved over for a new road. Every time the slow England he had loved as a boy had been visibly diminished by the hard schedule of the 20th century. The elves were, in this sense, the most sympathetic of the ring-bearers in his whole myth. They had loved Middle-earth deeply, and they had wished only to keep its fairer parts as fair as they had been in their own youth. And yet, the lore tells us even that longing had to be given up in the end. The 3 rings could not be kept. To keep them would have been, in the long event, to hold Lothlorien and Rivendell and the Grey Havens apart from the long natural seasons of the world, to make them small islands of frozen time in a flowing river, to refuse them the slow, gentle change that all living things must accept if they are to remain living things. The elves at the end of the Third Age chose, with great sadness but with great wisdom, to let go. They cast their rings down with the master ring. They permitted their long-preserved lands to begin at last the slow weathering that the wider world had been undergoing all along, and they went, those who would still go, into the west. The dwarves' 7 rings, in the deeper reading, were the longing to multiply, the longing to take a fair thing that one had made and to make 10 more of it, and 100 more, and 1,000, in great heaped abundance. The dwarves loved their craft. They loved especially gold, the soft, warm metal whose color was the color of slow firelight. They had made, in their long history, many great works of gold, crowns and torques and necklaces and the great inlaid chambers of their deep halls. The 7 rings stirred in them not a new desire but an amplification of an old one, until what had been a craftsman's love of working gold became a hoarder's compulsion to pile gold high and to sit upon it in the dark and to count it. The dragons came for the hoards. They came because they too loved gold, and they could smell it across hundreds of leagues of cold air. And so 4 of the 7 dwarven kingdoms were ruined not by Sauron's direct hand, but by the dwarves' own 7 rings drawing the dragons down upon them. The lesson, dear listener, is not that gold is evil. The lesson is that the longing to multiply a good thing beyond all measure is a longing that, given a strong enough vessel, becomes a chain. The dwarves who survived the fall of their kingdoms were, in the long event, the dwarves who had found ways to set down their rings, to refuse the long heaping, to remember that craft is the love of making the next thing well, and not the love of having 10,000 of the last. The mortal men's 9 rings, in the deeper reading, were the longing to escape mortality, the longing to be released from the slow turning of years that closes upon every mortal life. This was, Tolkien wrote in his letters, the longing he reckoned the most dangerous of all the longings the rings could feed upon, because it touched upon the deepest hurt of the mortal condition. Mortal men were given by Ilúvatar a great strange gift, the gift of death, the gift of being released when the long road was done, from the long weariness of the world, and so going on beyond the boundaries of Arda to some other and further life that even the Vala themselves did not know. It was meant as a gift. It was misunderstood by men as a doom, and in that misunderstanding lay the slow corruption of the whole long history of mortal kings. The 9 men who took the 9 rings were promised the long life that mortal men feared they lacked, and they received that long life in great abundance. And in receiving it, they lost themselves. They faded. They became wraiths. They walked the long centuries in growing thinness, neither dead nor properly alive, ever bound to the Dark Lord whose servants they had become. The lesson is not that long life is evil. The lesson is that the longing to refuse mortality at any cost is a longing that, given a strong enough vessel, devours the very self that wished to be preserved. The men who flourished in the long Fourth Age were the men who, having come through the war, returned to the small mortal lives that had been theirs all along, and lived them well, and accepted at the end the gift of death when their time came. And the one ring, dear listener, in the deepest reading of all, was the longing to dominate, the longing to take all the small free wills of the world and bind them into the single tidy pattern of the one. This was Sauron's longing, deeper than any of the others, the longing that had drawn him in the elder days from Orly's bright forges into Melkor's dark service, and had carried him across all the long ages to the secret forge at Orodruin, and to the slow, patient labor in which he had poured himself into a small gold band. The One Ring was not, in this deepest reading, a separate thing from the Dark Lord. It was the Dark Lord himself, distilled into a vessel small enough to be slipped onto a finger. It was the longing for total order, total control, total binding of all the world's small, untidy free wills into the single hum of the running of the whole. And the lesson, dear listener, the deep lesson Tolkien set at the very heart of his myth, is that the only answer to such a longing is not a counter-longing of equal strength, but a small refusal of the longing altogether. The free peoples of Middle-earth did not defeat Sauron by gathering an army greater than his and overwhelming him in the field. They tried that once, at the last alliance, and they prevailed in the field but failed at the moment of unmaking. For Isildur, at the lip of the chasm 3,000 years before Frodo stood there, had been unable to set the ring aside. The free peoples defeated Sauron at last by carrying his ring quietly and patiently to the only place where it could be unmade, and there letting it be unmade by an accident of mercy that no greater hand had planned. They defeated him by refusing at the very last hour to use the ring themselves. They defeated him by the small refusal, by the long line of small refusals that ran through the whole of the tale. Bilbo refused to slay Gollum. Frodo refused to slay Gollum. Faramir refused to slay Gollum. Sam, at the last, refused to slay Gollum. Galadriel, when Frodo, in his small gentleness, offered her the ring beside her mirror in Lothlorien, refused to take it, though her heart longed for it, and the offer was sincere. Gandalf, when Frodo at Bag End, at the beginning of the journey, offered the ring to him, refused to touch it. Aragorn, who as the heir of Isildur had perhaps the strongest claim of any living man to the ring, refused throughout the whole long journey to take it. The whole of the great victory hung upon those small refusals, each made in the small private hour by a small private will, each made without the certainty that any other refusal would follow. The ring was unmade because, link by quiet link, the chain of would-be claimers was broken, and the small hobbit at the lip of the chasm was permitted by his predecessors' refusals to fail without the failure mattering. And the rings, dear listener, the 20 rings of power that we have followed tonight from the bright forges of Eregion to the cold waters of the Anduin, to the dark cave beneath the misty mountains, to the small carved chest at Bag End, to the red fire of Orodruin. The 20 rings are the visible signs of that long, quiet contest between the longing to bind and the willingness to let go. The elves, in the end, let go. The dwarves, in their own slower way, let go. The men of the Nine never let go, and they became wraiths. Sauron never let go, and he was unmade, and the small ring of all rings, the one that had carried within it the long distilled longing of the Dark Lord himself, was unmade by an accident that the long line of mercy had prepared. The pattern closed. The world was given back to its own slow seasons. The Fourth Age began. And so we come, dear listener, to the end of tonight's long road. The rings were forged in Eregion in the bright years of the Second Age. The One Ring was forged in secret in the deep heat of Orodruin. The long wars that followed cost the lives of 2 high kings and many tens of thousands of free peoples, and the ring was at last cut from the Dark Lord's hand by a broken shard of a great sword, and was at last lost in the cold waters of a great river. It slept 3,000 years in the silt. It rose. It corrupted Smeagol. It passed into the hands of Bilbo. It came to Frodo. It was carried by Frodo and Sam across half a continent into the very mountain in which it had been made, and there by an accident of mercy that the whole long tale had been quietly preparing, it was unmade. The Dark Lord fell. The free peoples rebuilt. The elves departed. The age of men began, and a small gardener in a small green country sat down at his own hearth at last, with his small wife and his small daughter, and said 3 small words to mark the long ending. "Well," he said, "I'm back. Farewell for now, dear listener, until the next path home."